Hey there, friend, come settle in, get that pillow just right, pull that blanket up a little closer. Tonight I want to tell you about something that changed everything. A moment in history so devastating, so absolutely terrifying that it rewrote the rules of human civilization. And it all started with 12 ships cutting through calm Mediterranean waters on an autumn morning that smelled like salt and sunshine. Imagine standing on the docks of Messina, Sicily, in October of 1347. The sun is warming your face, gulls are crying overhead, and you can hear the bustle of the market behind you, vendors hawking fresh fish and bread. You are watching ships approach from the east, their sails billowing in the wind. These are Genoese trading vessels returning from the Black Sea with exotic goods, spices, silks, stories from faraway lands. You are excited. Your neighbours are excited. Ships mean commerce, gossip, maybe even letters from loved ones you have not seen in years. But as these 12 ships draw closer, something feels wrong. The usual shouts and songs from the sailors, that chaotic symphony of men who have been at sea for weeks, it is absent. The vessels drift into port with an eerie, unnatural silence. And when the docking ropes are finally secured and people rush forward to greet the crews, they discover a scene straight out of hell itself. Most of the sailors are dead, not recently dead. We are talking about bodies in various stages of decomposition slumped over oars and cargo, their skin blackened and covered in grotesque swellings the size of apples. The stench hits you like a wall. It is not just the smell of unwashed men after a long voyage. It is something darker, sweeter, more wrong. It is the smell of decay, of disease, of death, and the ones who are still breathing. They are not much better off. They are delirious with fever, vomiting blood, their bodies covered in dark, oozing boils. Some of these buboes, as they would come to be called, are black as coal. Others are purple weeping pus and blood that stains their clothes and pools on the ship's deck. The officials of Messina, to their credit, immediately ordered these death ships out of the harbour. "Get out," they said. "Take your sickness and go." But it was already too late. You see, the moment those ships docked, the moment the ropes touched the pier, the moment a single flea-infested rat scurried down onto Sicilian soil, the fate of Europe was sealed. What arrived in Messina that October day was not just a disease, it was the Black Death. And over the next 5 years it would kill somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. Let that sink in for a second. 50 million. That is roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's entire population. Gone in 5 years. Let me paint you a picture of what that actually means, because numbers that big can feel almost abstract. Imagine if today, right now, 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you know just vanished. Your neighbour, who always waves when you check the mail, your co-worker who makes terrible jokes by the coffee machine, maybe your sister, your best friend, your kid's teacher. Entire neighbourhoods emptied. Schools closed forever because there were no children left to teach. Farms abandoned mid-harvest, the wheat and barley rotting in the fields because everyone who knew how to bring them in was dead. Cities that once hummed with life and commerce reduced to ghost towns where stray dogs wandered empty streets. This was not some distant, abstract historical event. This was real people living real lives, watching their world literally die around them. And the speed of it, that is what made it so absolutely terrifying. You could go to bed healthy, maybe feeling a slight chill, thinking nothing of it, and wake up at dawn knowing with certainty that you would be dead by sunset. 3 days. That was the average timeline from first symptoms to death. 3 days to say goodbye to everyone you loved, to make peace with your God, to prepare yourself for whatever came next. Some people did not even get that long. There are accounts of people collapsing in the street, seemingly healthy, one moment dead the next. Now, before we go any deeper, I want you to understand something important. The story of the Black Death is not just about death. I mean, yes, obviously there is going to be a lot of death. We cannot and should not sugarcoat that. But what makes this story so compelling, so relevant, even 700 years later, is that it's also about survival. It is about human resilience in the face of the unimaginable. It is about how people, when everything they knew was crumbling to dust, found ways to endure, to adapt, to protect the ones they loved, to keep going, even when every rational part of their brain was screaming at them to give up. So where did this nightmare come from? Well, like most truly terrible things in history, the answer is complicated. The plague that caused the Black Death did not just suddenly appear in Sicily out of nowhere. It had been killing people in Asia for years before it ever reached European shores. Most historians believe it originated somewhere in Central Asia, possibly in China or the vast grasslands of Mongolia. From there it travelled along the Silk Road, those ancient trade routes that had been connecting east and west for centuries. And this is where our story takes a turn into something almost too bizarre to believe. You see those 12 ships that arrived in Messina. They had just fled from a city called Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula right on the Black Sea. And Kaffa had recently been under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde, one of the most fearsome military forces in the medieval world. Now sieges in the 1300s were brutal grinding affairs. Armies would surround a city, cut off all supplies and just wait for the people inside to starve or surrender. Months could go by, sometimes years, but this particular siege took a dark, unprecedented turn. The Mongol army led by a Khan named Jani Beg started getting sick. Plague was tearing through their ranks like wildfire, killing soldiers by the hundreds, maybe thousands. The Khan watched his army literally dying around him. And Jani Beg, whether out of desperation, frustration, or pure vindictive spite, decided to do something that would echo through the centuries. He ordered his men to load the plague-ridden corpses into catapults and launch them over the city walls into Kaffa. Yes, you heard that right. They weaponized dead bodies. They turned human corpses into ammunition. This might actually be one of the first recorded instances of biological warfare in human history. The Mongols literally bombarded the city with infected bodies, hoping to spread the disease to the people inside. And it worked. The plague took hold in Kaffa, spreading from person to person, killing quickly and without mercy. And when it became clear the city was doomed, that there was no way to stop this invisible enemy, the Italian merchants trapped inside did what made sense to them at the time. They fled. They got on their ships packed with whatever goods and valuables they could grab and sailed west, toward home, toward safety, toward the familiar shores of Italy and the promise of doctors who might understand what was happening. Except they were not sailing towards safety. They were sailing toward catastrophe. Because on those ships, nestled in the cargo holds, hiding in the coils of rope and sacks of grain, living in the dark spaces between the planks, were thousands of rats. Black rats, brown rats, rats that had been living alongside humans for so long they barely seemed remarkable. And on those rats were fleas. Tiny, insignificant insects that fed on rat blood. And in those fleas was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. That is the scientific name, but you do not need to remember it. What you need to understand is that this microorganism, so small it would be invisible to the human eye for another 400 years, was about to bring the most powerful civilization on Earth to its knees. The plague spread through Europe with a speed that is almost impossible to comprehend even today. From Sicily it jumped to the Italian mainland. Pisa fell, then Genoa, Venice, Florence. These were some of the wealthiest, most sophisticated cities in the world, centres of art and commerce and learning, and they fell like dominoes. By January of 1348, just 3 months after those 12 ships docked in Messina, the plague had reached Marseille in southern France. By summer, it had swept through Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon. It crossed the English Channel to London. It pushed north into Germany, Denmark, Sweden. It travelled east, moving along trade routes and rivers, eventually reaching as far as Russia. By 1353, barely 6 years after it began, there was not a corner of Europe that had not been touched by death. And here is what really gets me, what keeps me up at night thinking about this. The people living through this nightmare had no idea what was happening. They did not know about bacteria. They had never seen a microbe under a microscope because microscopes would not be invented for another 300 years. They did not understand how diseases spread, not really. The best medical minds of the age were still working with theories developed by ancient Greek physicians over 1,000 years earlier. So when the plague arrived, when people started dropping dead by the thousands, they scrambled for explanations that made sense within their medieval worldview. Some blame the alignment of the planets, thinking that Mars and Jupiter and Saturn had formed some catastrophic conjunction that poisoned the air itself. Others thought it was earthquakes or volcanoes releasing toxic vapours from deep within the earth. The official explanation from the medical faculty at the University of Paris, literally the smartest doctors in Europe, involved astronomical charts and complex calculations about corrupted air and evil humours. And then there were the religious explanations. Many people, maybe even most people, believe the plague was divine punishment. God's wrath unleashed upon humanity for their sins. The churches were packed with terrified believers praying for mercy, for deliverance, for some sign that this nightmare would end. Priests led processions through plague-stricken streets, carrying holy relics, chanting prayers, begging for salvation. But prayers did not stop the plague. Celestial charts did not stop it. Holy water and sacred relics and all the faith in the world did not stop it. Nothing stopped it. It rolled across Europe like a dark tide, indifferent to borders, to social class, to age, or piety, or goodness. It killed peasants and it killed kings. It killed priests and prostitutes and everyone in between. It killed the old and it killed the heartbreakingly young babies who never got a chance to live. Let me give you some numbers, because sometimes numbers help make the scale of this tragedy truly sink in. In Florence, one of the great jewels of Renaissance culture, home to artists and poets and thinkers, the population dropped from somewhere between 110,000 and 120,000 people in 1338 to just 50,000 in 1351. That is more than half the city gone. Tax records, which medieval governments kept meticulously because they loved their money, show that 80% of Florence die within 4 months in 1348. 4 months. In Paris, they were burying 800 people every single day at the height of the outbreak. 800. That is not a typo. Every sunrise, 800 new bodies that needed to be dealt with somehow. In Hamburg and Bremen, at least 60% of the population perished. In London, the death toll may have reached 62,000 between 1346 and 1353. And these are just the places where we have records where someone survived long enough to write things down. Thousands of small villages across the European countryside simply ceased to exist. The few survivors, if there were any, packed up what they could carry and fled to larger towns, hoping desperately to find safety in numbers. Though, of course, that just made things worse by concentrating people together. Germany alone lost nearly 40,000 settlements between the initial outbreak and 1450. 40,000 communities with their own stories and histories and traditions wiped off the map as if they had never existed at all. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Okay, this is all incredibly grim and depressing, but what does it have to do with survival? How did anyone make it through this? Well, that is exactly what makes this story so fascinating, so worth telling. Because people did survive. Not everyone, obviously. But enough people lived through the Black Death that civilization did not completely collapse. Europe did not revert to some post-apocalyptic wasteland, and the ways people survived the choices they made, the strategies they employed, some of which actually worked, and some of which made things catastrophically worse. Those are the lessons that echo down through the centuries to us today. But before we get to the survival strategies, before we talk about quarantines and plague doctors and the radical transformation of medieval society, we need to understand what life was like before the plague arrived. Because here is the thing that most history books gloss over. Europe in the 1300s was not some golden age of prosperity and peace. It was not a healthy, thriving civilization suddenly struck down by random tragedy. Number Europe in 1347 was already a world teetering on the edge of disaster. The Black Death did not strike a strong society. It struck a population that was already weakened, already struggling already, one bad harvest away from complete catastrophe. Think about it. By 1347, Europe had been dealing with crisis after crisis for decades. There was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. 7 long years of crop failures and starvation that killed millions of people across northern Europe. Entire families starved to death. Parents watched their children die of hunger, unable to help them. There are accounts, horrible accounts, of people resorting to eating grass tree bark, even each other in the worst hit areas. And the famine was caused by something called the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that had begun at the end of the 13th century. Summers got shorter and cooler. Winters got longer and more brutal. The growing season for crops, which was already pretty marginal in northern Europe, shrunk to a razor-thin margin. One bad storm, one early frost, and entire regions could starve. And then there were the wars. Always the wars. The 100 Years' War between England and France was just kicking off in 1337, and it would drag on with brief interruptions for over a century. That meant armies tramping across the countryside, burning crops, stealing livestock, killing anyone who got in the way. It meant peasants getting drafted to fight battles they did not understand for lords they had never met. It meant taxes going up and up and up to pay for soldiers and weapons and castles. In China, things were even worse. A devastating civil war between the Mongol rulers and the native Chinese population had been raging since 1205, over a century of near constant warfare. Armies on the move meant refugees on the move. Refugees meant overcrowded cities. Overcrowded cities with poor sanitation and limited food meant the perfect breeding ground for epidemic disease. But there is something else. Something even more fundamental that made Europe vulnerable to the plague. The population had simply grown too large for the available resources. Between the year 1000 and 1347, Europe's population had exploded from about 35 million to 80 million people, more than double. And medieval agriculture, even with improvements like the heavy plough and crop rotation systems, could barely keep pace with that kind of growth. Most people, the vast majority of the population, were subsisting on the bare minimum of calories needed to survive. Bread and porridge and ale, day after day after day. Meat was a luxury most peasants saw maybe once or twice a year, on special feast days. Malnutrition was rampant, especially among the poor, which was almost everyone. And we know now from modern science that malnutrition weakens the immune system dramatically. It makes people far more susceptible to infectious disease. So when the plague arrived, it was not just attacking a healthy population, it was attacking people whose bodies were already running on empty. So when the Black Death finally reached Europe in 1347, it was not just a plague. It was the final devastating blow to a society that was already fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. It was famine and war and environmental crisis and overpopulation all converging at once. It was the perfect storm of biological, environmental and social catastrophe. And the result was something that would fundamentally, irrevocably reshape the course of human history. You might be wondering why I am spending so much time on all this background on the setup on the state of Europe before the plague hit. And it is because understanding context is everything. The Black Death did not happen in a vacuum. The people who lived through it were not abstract historical figures or statistics in a textbook. They were human beings just like us, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. They were farmers and bakers and blacksmiths and mothers and children, people with hopes and fears and dreams and loved ones. And the choices they made, the ways they responded to this unimaginable crisis, those choices still matter today. They tell us something fundamental about what it means to be human, about how we cope when everything falls apart. Over the next couple of hours, you and I are going to walk through this story together. We are going to meet doctors who tried every bizarre remedy they could think of, from bloodletting to bathing in urine, in desperate attempts to save their patients. We are going to see how some communities banded together, taking care of each other, while others tore themselves apart, looking for someone to blame. We are going to explore the birth of modern public health measures, including quarantine, a concept that turned out to be so effective we are still using it 700 years later. We are going to talk about the survivors, about how they rebuilt their world from the ashes, about how the plague, for all its horror, actually created opportunities that would not have existed otherwise. But all of that comes later. Right now we are still standing on that dock in Messina, in October of 1347, watching those 12 ships arrive. The plague has just reached Europe. The people gathered on the shore, excited about commerce and news and adventure. They do not know it yet, but their world is about to change forever. Everything they understand about life and death and society and God, all of it is about to be tested in ways they cannot possibly imagine. And in the weeks and months to come, they are going to have to make impossible choices, face unimaginable horrors, and somehow find the strength to keep living, when death itself is literally knocking at their door, on their neighbour's door, on every door, in every street, in every city. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, adjust that pillow one more time, because this is a story about the darkest chapter in European history, yes, but it is also, and I cannot emphasize this enough, it is also a story about light, about the resilience of the human spirit, about how we survive even when survival seems impossible, about how in our darkest moments we discover strengths we never knew we had. The 12 ships have docked, the rats have scurried ashore, the fleas have found new hosts, the plague has arrived in Europe, and in the coming months and years it will reshape this continent in ways both terrible and strangely transformative. The world that existed before October 1347 will never return, but the world that emerges from the ashes of the Black Death will be something entirely new. And the story of how we got from one to the other, that is what we are here to explore together. So let us take those first steps into 1347, into a world about to be consumed by darkness, and discover how humanity found a way to survive, to endure, to eventually build something better from the ruins. The journey starts now. So we have established that Europe in 1347 was not exactly living its best life. But let me take you deeper into what that actually looked like on a day-to-day basis, because understanding the reality of medieval life is crucial to understanding why the plague was so devastating. Picture yourself as a peasant farmer in northern France, say around 1340. You wake up before dawn because there is no point in wasting daylight. Your house, if we can even call it that, is basically one room with dirt floors and a thatched roof that leaks when it rains. The walls are made of wattle and daub, which is just a fancy way of saying woven sticks covered in mud and straw. There are no windows, or maybe one tiny opening, covered with oiled cloth because glass is wildly expensive, and anyway, windows just let the cold in. Your bed is not really a bed. It is a pile of straw covered with whatever rough fabric you can afford, probably wool because linen is pricey. And here is something that might surprise you. During winter, you bring the animals inside. The family cow, maybe a pig if you are lucky, some chickens. Not because you love them so much, though. I am sure you do in your own way, but because their body heat helps keep everyone from freezing to death. So you are literally sharing your living space with livestock. The smell alone would probably knock us modern folks unconscious. You stumble out of bed, your joints aching, because you're probably only 35 years old, but your body feels 60. A lifetime of back-breaking labour will do that. The first thing you do is check if everyone in your family made it through the night. And I am not being dramatic here. Infant mortality in the medieval period was roughly 50%. 1 out of every 2 babies born did not make it to their first birthday. Childhood diseases, malnutrition accidents, infections from minor cuts, any of these could kill. So every morning that your children wake up breathing is genuinely a small miracle. Your wife is already up, coaxing life into the fire that smoulders in the central hearth. There is no chimney, just a hole in the roof, so the house is perpetually smoky. Your eyes burn, your lungs ache, but you are so used to it you barely notice anymore. She is making breakfast, which consists of some leftover bread from yesterday, maybe softened in ale because it is already going stale. Ale, by the way, is what everyone drinks, including children, because the water is often contaminated and will make you sick. The ale is weak, barely alcoholic, but the brewing process makes it safer than straight water. If it is a good day, there might be some cheese or a handful of dried peas to add to your bread. If it is a bad day, well, it is just bread and ale. Meat is something you see maybe on Christmas and Easter if you are lucky. The tax collector and the church have already claimed most of what you produce. You see, you do not actually own the land you farm. You are a tenant working land that belongs to a lord who probably lives in a manor house you have never been inside, or maybe even a castle if he is particularly wealthy. In exchange for the right to farm this land, you owe your lord labour. Several days a week you are required to work his fields instead of your own. And then there is the tithe to the church, 10% of everything you produce, plus various other fees and taxes, the mill where you grind your grain. You have to pay to use it, and you are legally forbidden from grinding grain anywhere else. Same with the oven where you bake bread. By the time you've paid everyone who has their hand out, you're left with barely enough to feed your family. Now multiply this scenario across millions of families throughout Europe. Everyone is living on the edge, one bad harvest away from starvation. And remember, we have already talked about the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. People have recent visceral memories of watching their loved ones starve to death. That kind of trauma does not just disappear. It lingers in the collective psyche of an entire generation. But here is where it gets interesting. And this is something historians sometimes overlook. Despite all this hardship, despite the grinding poverty and the constant spectre of death, medieval people were not miserable automatons. They had rich social lives. They celebrated feast days with genuine joy. They gathered in village squares for festivals. They told stories, sang songs, played games. The church calendar was packed with holy days, which were also holidays, days when work stopped and the community came together. There was a rhythm to medieval life, a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. Your village, your manor, your parish church, these were not just places. They were communities in the truest sense. Everyone knew everyone. When someone got married or had a baby or died, the whole village was involved. And this sense of community, this web of social connections was about to become crucial for survival in ways people could not possibly anticipate. Let me shift gears and talk about urban life, because cities in the 1300s were fascinating and frankly kind of terrifying places. If you lived in a city like Paris or London or Florence, your experience was completely different from our peasant farmer. Cities were where the action was. Trade, commerce, art, learning, all of it centered in urban areas. But oh my goodness, medieval cities were crowded. We are talking density levels that would make modern New York City look spacious. Houses were built right up against each other, often sharing walls. Streets were narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for two people to pass. And there was no such thing as urban planning in the way we understand it today. Buildings just kind of sprouted up wherever there was space. The sanitation situation was, to put it mildly, a disaster. There was no running water, no sewage system. People threw their waste into the streets or into rivers. Butchers dumped animal guts and blood into gutters. Tanners who treated leather with urine and animal feces operated right in the middle of residential areas. The stench must have been unbelievable. Some cities tried to regulate this. London, for example, had laws saying you could not dump waste in the Thames, but enforcing these laws was another matter entirely. And then there were the rats. Rats everywhere. In the walls under the floorboards, in the grain stores, in the markets. Medieval people accepted rats as just part of urban life, like we accept pigeons or squirrels today. Except rats, as we now know, carried fleas, and those fleas carried death. But in 1347 nobody made that connection. Rats were just rats, a nuisance, but not a threat. Despite the filth and the crowding cities offered opportunities that rural life did not. If you were a young person with ambition and skill, you could become an apprentice to a craftsman. You could learn a trade, join a guild, maybe even become a master craftsman yourself one day. Guilds controlled everything in medieval cities. There were guilds for bakers, guilds for blacksmiths, guilds for weavers, guilds for goldsmiths. Each guild had strict rules about who could practice the craft, how things should be made, what prices could be charged. And here is something interesting about medieval cities. They were surprisingly cosmopolitan. You would hear a dozen different languages spoken in the markets. There were Italian bankers, German merchants, Jewish moneylenders, Muslim traders from North Africa and the Middle East. Yes, there was prejudice and discrimination, sometimes violent discrimination, but there was also a level of cultural mixing that might surprise you. Women in cities had more options than their rural counterparts, though. We should not romanticize this. Most women's work was still domestic or agricultural, but in cities you could find women running alehouses, working as seamstresses selling goods in markets. Widows could inherit their husbands' businesses and run them independently. It was not equality by any stretch, but it was more opportunity than a peasant woman had. Now let us talk about what happened when you got sick in the medieval period, because this is going to be important when we get to the plague itself. Medieval medicine was, how do I put this gently, a complete mess. It was based almost entirely on the theories of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, particularly a guy named Galen who lived in the 2nd century AD. Galen believed in something called the theory of the four humours. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 basic fluids or humours: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was all about keeping these humours in balance. If you got sick, it meant your humours were out of whack, and the treatment involved trying to rebalance them. So if you had too much blood, the solution was bloodletting. A doctor or barber surgeon would cut open a vein and drain out some of your blood. Sometimes they used leeches, which would attach to your skin and suck blood. If you had too much phlegm, you needed to purge it by making yourself vomit or by taking strong laxatives. The logic made sense within their framework, but from a modern perspective, these treatments often made people worse, not better. Medieval physicians also believed strongly in something called miasma theory. The idea was that diseases were caused by bad air, by foul-smelling vapours that rose from rotting organic matter or stagnant water. This is why doctors wore those famous birdbeak masks during later plague outbreaks. The long beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, which they believed would filter out the bad air and protect them from disease. Now here is the thing. Miasma theory was wrong. We know now that diseases are caused by germs, by microscopic organisms, but miasma theory was not completely useless. If you believed bad air caused disease, you might take steps to improve sanitation, to clean up filth, to avoid places that smelled terrible. And those actions, even if done for the wrong reasons, could actually reduce the spread of disease in some cases. It is a weird historical irony. But when the plague arrived, all of this medical knowledge, all of these theories and treatments turned out to be worse than useless. Bloodletting a plague patient just weakened them faster. Purging them drained what little strength they had left. The aromatic herbs and the plague doctor masks did absolutely nothing to stop bacteria. Medieval medicine was completely, utterly helpless in the face of the Black Death, and the doctors knew it. We have written accounts from physicians who watched helplessly as patient after patient died. Imagine being a doctor in 1348. You've spent years studying, learning from the great medical texts, training under experienced physicians. You believe you understand how the body works, how to restore health, and then this disease arrives and nothing you do makes any difference. People die whether you treat them or not. In fact, they might die faster because of your treatments. Some doctors fled. Who can blame them? They saw the writing on the wall, but others stayed and many of them died for it. Gentile de Foligno, one of the most respected physicians in Italy, stayed in Perugia treating plague patients. He wrote detailed observations about the disease, trying to understand it, trying to find something, anything that might help. He died in June 1348, killed by the disease he was trying to cure. His last writings show a man grappling with the limits of his knowledge, admitting that conventional treatments were not working, begging for new approaches. Here is where the human story really gets complicated, though. Because while doctors were struggling and failing to cure the plague, ordinary people were making their own decisions about how to survive. And these decisions reveal something profound about human nature under extreme stress. Some people faced with this incomprehensible catastrophe doubled down on their faith. If the plague was God's punishment, then maybe God could be appeased. Huge religious processions wound through plague-stricken cities. People prayed until their voices gave out. They bought religious amulets and charms or relics of saints that were supposed to offer protection. Churches did a booming business in holy water, blessed candles, anything that might ward off death. And then there were the flagellants, groups of men who believed they could atone for humanity's sins through self-punishment. They would parade through towns, stripping to the waist and whipping themselves until their backs were bloody. The Pope eventually condemned this practice, not because it was brutal, but because it was happening outside the Church's control. People were finding their own path to God, and the Church was not okay with that. Other people responded in completely different ways. If death was coming regardless, why not enjoy life while you still had it? This is where we get that phrase, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." Some people threw caution to the wind, hosting feasts and parties, even as bodies piled up in the streets. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio, in his masterpiece The Decameron, describes exactly this phenomenon. Young people fleeing Florence not to hide in fear, but to enjoy themselves in a country villa, telling stories and laughing and living while they still could. Was this callous, maybe? Or maybe it was the most human response imaginable. When faced with the certainty of death, some people choose joy over despair. They choose connection over isolation. They choose to affirm life even in the shadow of death. I find that deeply moving, actually. But there was a darker side to all this fear and confusion. When people cannot understand what is happening, when they cannot control their circumstances, they look for someone to blame. And in medieval Europe, the people who got blamed were the usual suspects, outsiders, minorities, anyone who was different. Jewish communities suffered horrifically during the Black Death. Rumours spread that Jews were poisoning wells, deliberately causing the plague. These rumours were absurd, of course. Jews were dying of plague just like everyone else. But logic does not matter when people are terrified and looking for a scapegoat. Entire Jewish communities were massacred. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in February 1349. In Basel, the entire Jewish population was herded into a wooden building and set on fire. The Pope, to his credit, issued a papal bull stating that Jews were not responsible for the plague and that killing them was a sin. But his words had little effect. The violence continued. It is one of the darkest chapters in an already dark story, and it reminds us that pandemics do not just kill through disease, they kill through the fear and hatred they unleash in desperate people. Lepers, beggars, foreigners, they also faced persecution. Anyone who seemed different, anyone who could be othered became a potential target. It is a pattern we see repeated throughout history, unfortunately. Even in recent time, during the COVID pandemic, we saw similar scapegoating though, thankfully not on the same violent scale. Fear makes us do terrible things sometimes. But you know what else happened? Acts of extraordinary courage and compassion. Priests who stayed with their dying parishioners when they could have fled. Neighbours who cared for each other's children when parents fell ill. Doctors who treated patients knowing they would probably contract the disease themselves. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because that is what the moment demanded. The Black Death revealed both the best and worst of human nature. It showed us our capacity for cruelty, yes, but also our capacity for love, for sacrifice, for perseverance. And that is why this story, as dark as it is, as full of suffering and death as it is, remains fundamentally a story about survival. About the choices we make when everything is falling apart. So we have painted a picture now of Europe in the years before and during the early plague. A world already under immense strain, hit by the worst pandemic in recorded history. A world where medicine was powerless, where social structures were crumbling, where fear and confusion reigned. But also a world where people were figuring out slowly and painfully how to respond. Some of their responses were counterproductive or even harmful, but some of them actually worked. And that is what we're going to explore next. Because amid all this chaos and death, people started developing survival strategies. Some were based on superstition, some were based on keen observation, some were lucky accidents. But a few of them, a precious few, actually helped slow the spread of the plague. And one of those strategies, quarantine, would become one of the most important tools in public health, a concept so effective that we are still using it 7 centuries later. So let us turn our attention to the people who survived and ask the question, how did they do it? What choices did they make? And what can we learn from them today? When you think about it, survival during the Black Death came down to one fundamental question. How do you protect yourself from something you cannot see, cannot understand, and cannot fight? The answer, it turns out, was not found in medical textbooks or religious doctrine. It was discovered through trial and error, through desperate experimentation, and sometimes through pure accident. And the most effective strategy, the one that would save countless lives and influence public health policy for the next 700 years, came from an unlikely source, a small port city on the Adriatic coast that had already lost nearly half its population. Let me tell you about Ragusa, which today we know as Dubrovnik, Croatia. In 1348, the plague had devastated this beautiful coastal city. Ships arrived daily from plague-stricken ports across the Mediterranean, and with them came death. The city officials, watching their population collapse, realized something that seems obvious to us now but was revolutionary. Then the plague was spreading from person to person and from place to place through contact and travel. Think about how radical this observation was. Remember, most people believed the plague was caused by corrupted air or divine punishment or astrological alignments. But the leaders of Ragusa looked at the patterns and saw something different. They noticed that when infected ships arrived, the plague followed. When travellers from plague-stricken areas entered the city, new cases appeared. It was not about bad air or God's wrath. It was about transmission. So in 1377, nearly 30 years after the first wave of plague, Ragusa implemented something unprecedented. They required all ships arriving from plague-affected areas to anchor in a designated location outside the city for 30 days before anyone could disembark. 30 days of isolation. They called this period Trentine, from the Italian word for 30. If after 30 days everyone on board was still healthy, they could enter the city. If people got sick during those 30 days, well, the ship stayed put until everyone either recovered or died. Later, other cities extended this to 40 days, which they called quarantino, from the Italian word for 40, and that is where we get our modern word quarantine. 40 days of enforced isolation. Why 40? Probably because 40 was a significant number in Christian tradition. Jesus fasted for 40 days. The flood lasted 40 days. It was a number with religious weight which helped people accept the policy. Now, did the people of Ragusa understand germ theory? Did they know about bacteria or viral transmission? Of course not. Microscopes had not been invented yet. The entire field of microbiology was still centuries away, but they understood patterns. They understood cause and effect, and they were willing to try something new when everything else had failed. And here is the remarkable thing: it worked. Not perfectly, nothing could stop the plague entirely once it had established itself in a region. But quarantine significantly slowed the spread. Cities that implemented strict quarantine measures had lower death rates than those that did not. It is one of the first examples in history of evidence-based public health policy. Venice, that grand maritime republic, took quarantine even further. They established lazarettos, which were entire islands dedicated to isolating potentially infected people and goods. The most famous was Lazaretto Nuovo, an island in the Venetian lagoon, where ships had to unload their cargo and crew for inspection and isolation. Some goods like fabrics and furs, which they believed could carry the disease, had to be aired out for up to 40 days before being allowed into the city. Venice also created something else entirely new, a permanent health board, the Magistrato alla Sanità, established in 1486. This was essentially the world's first department of public health. They had the authority to enforce quarantine, to inspect ships, to close businesses if necessary, to track the spread of disease. They compiled records, collected data, and used that information to make decisions. It was the beginning of what we now call epidemiology, the science of how diseases spread through populations. But I want to be honest with you about something. Quarantine was deeply unpopular. Can you imagine being a merchant who had just spent months sailing from the east, your ship loaded with expensive cargo, only to be told you had to sit in a harbour for 40 days watching your goods potentially spoil and your profits evaporate? Or being a sailor desperate to see your family, after a long cruising voyage forced to stay on your ship within sight of home but unable to reach it? And for people trapped in quarantine stations, the conditions were often brutal. Crowded, unsanitary facilities where healthy people were mixed with the sick, inadequate food and water, no medical care to speak of. Sometimes quarantine killed people who might have survived, otherwise not from plague but from the harsh conditions of isolation itself. Plus, enforcement was a nightmare. Rich people could often bribe their way out of quarantine. Important cargo might be rushed through without proper inspection if the right palms were greased. And smugglers, they had a field day. There was always someone willing to sneak goods or people past the quarantine stations for the right price. Every public health measure, no matter how well-intentioned, has to deal with the reality of human nature. Some people will always put their own interests ahead of the common good. But despite all these problems, despite the protests and the corruption and the hardships, quarantine became the standard response to plague outbreaks across Europe. And the reason is simple: it was the only thing that actually worked. When Venice rigorously enforced quarantine during later plague outbreaks in the 15th and 16th centuries, the death toll was significantly lower than in cities that did not. The evidence was undeniable. Let me shift gears for a moment and talk about another survival strategy, one that was less effective but reveals a lot about human psychology during crisis. Flight, simply running away from the plague. If you were wealthy, fleeing was often your first and best option. Pack up your family, your valuables, your servants, and get out of the city. Head for your country estate or a rural village where population density was lower and the plague might not reach. This was not cowardice exactly, it was rational self-preservation, and it often worked, at least temporarily. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, which I mentioned earlier, is built around this premise. 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men flee plague-stricken Florence for a country villa. While death rages in the city, they spend their days in gardens and comfortable rooms telling each other stories to pass the time. It is a beautiful, melancholy book full of humour and wisdom and very human observations about life and death. But here is the uncomfortable truth: only the wealthy could afford to flee. Peasants and labourers and craftspeople, they were stuck. They could not abandon their land or their workshops or their obligations to their lords. Flight was a survival strategy of privilege. And this pattern where the rich can protect themselves while the poor bear the brunt of disaster is something we see over and over throughout history. It happened during the Black Death. It happened during cholera outbreaks in the 19th century. It happened during COVID-19 when wealthy people could work from home while essential workers had to risk exposure. I am not saying this to make anyone feel guilty. I'm just pointing out that pandemics reveal and amplify existing inequalities. They always have. The Black Death was not an equal opportunity killer. Yes, it killed people from all social classes, including kings and nobles. But the poor died in much greater numbers, partly because they could not flee, partly because they were malnourished and more vulnerable to disease, and partly because they lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions that facilitated transmission. Now, for people who could not or would not flee, there were other strategies. Some of them were useless, some were actively harmful, and a few actually helped. Let me walk you through some of the more interesting ones. First, there was the whole category of preventative medicine based on miasma theory. If bad air caused the plague, then good air would prevent it, right? So people burned aromatic woods and herbs in their homes. Juniper, rosemary, pine, anything with a strong, pleasant smell. They carried sachets of herbs in their pockets. They doused themselves in perfumes and vinegars. Some people held sponges soaked in vinegar to their noses when they had to go outside. And you know what? This probably helped a little bit, but not for the reason they thought. Burning wood created smoke, and smoke can repel insects, including fleas. The vinegar and strong-smelling herbs might have had mild antibacterial properties. And the practice of covering your nose and mouth probably reduced transmission in cases where the plague had evolved into its pneumonic form, which spread through respiratory droplets. So even though the underlying theory was wrong, some of the practices had marginal benefits. Then there was the question of diet. Medieval physicians believed that certain foods could strengthen your body's resistance to disease by balancing your humours, so they recommended eating light, easily digestible foods. Avoid rich meats and heavy wines. Drink barley water. Eat figs and pomegranates. Some physicians recommended fasting, believing it would purify the body. Was this helpful? Hard to say. A lighter diet might have been easier on digestive systems already stressed by fear and anxiety. Staying hydrated, which barley water would help with, is always good, but fasting. That just weakened people who were already malnourished. Again, we see this pattern of practices that might have marginal benefits mixed with practices that were actively harmful. One thing that definitely helped, though, nobody quite understood why, was social distancing. Some cities passed ordinances limiting public gatherings. Markets were restricted. Churches limited the size of funeral services, or banned them altogether in some cases. Public baths, which were popular social centres in medieval cities, were closed. People were encouraged to stay in their homes as much as possible. In some Italian cities, if someone in your household got sick, your whole family was sealed inside your house for 40 days. Guards were posted at your door to make sure nobody left. Food would be brought to you, but you could not go out. Can you imagine being locked in your home, watching your family members die one by one, unable to escape, unable to get help, just waiting to see if the disease would take you too? This practice, which they called sealing, was incredibly traumatic. And it was not always effective because by the time someone showed symptoms, they might have already infected others outside the home. But it did slow transmission in some cases, and it established the principle that infected people needed to be separated from healthy people, which is fundamental to modern infection control. There was also the practice of fumigation and cleaning. Some cities hired crews to clean the streets to remove garbage and waste to whitewash buildings. Milan, which had one of the lowest death rates during the Black Death, was fanatical about cleaning. They sealed up infected houses and sometimes burned them to the ground. They removed bodies immediately and buried them in mass graves far outside the city. They essentially treated plague like it was a contaminant that could be physically removed. Again, they did not understand the actual mechanism of disease transmission. But by removing potential breeding grounds for rats and fleas by disposing of contaminated materials, they were inadvertently breaking the chain of infection. Milan's aggressive public health measures saved thousands of lives, even though the people implementing them had no idea why they were working. Let me tell you about one more strategy, and this one is going to sound absolutely insane until I explain it. Some people deliberately moved into houses where plague victims had recently died. Yes, you heard that right. They moved into contaminated houses on purpose. Why would anyone do this? Well, there was a theory widely believed at the time that if you survived exposure to the plague, you could not get it again. And there was some truth to this, actually. People who survived bubonic plague often had some immunity to future infections. So the logic went like this: expose yourself to a small amount of plague early on, while you are still healthy and strong, and you might get a mild case that you can survive. Then you would be immune and could go about your life without fear. This is actually a primitive form of inoculation, the principle that would later lead to vaccination. And some people did survive this way, but many more died. It was a desperate gamble, and for most people the odds were not good. But the fact that people were even trying this shows how sophisticated some medieval thinking was. They were observing patterns, forming hypotheses, testing them. It was not scientific in the modern sense, but it was empirical. It was the beginning of what would eventually become the scientific method. All of these strategies, from quarantine to flight to fumigation to deliberate exposure, they all reflect people trying to understand and control a phenomenon that was beyond their comprehension. They did not have the tools or knowledge we have today. They were working in the dark quite literally. But they were working, they were trying. They were refusing to simply accept death as inevitable. And some of their innovations, particularly quarantine and isolation, turned out to be so effective that we are still using them today. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, what did governments around the world do? They implemented quarantines. They closed borders. They enforced social distancing. They isolated the sick. These are medieval strategies developed 700 years ago by people who did not understand germs but understood patterns and transmission. That is pretty remarkable when you think about it. The people of the 14th century, working with limited knowledge and primitive tools, figured out principles of disease control that remain valid in the 21st century. It is a testament to human ingenuity and observational skills. We are very good at pattern recognition, at seeing cause and effect, even when we do not understand the underlying mechanisms. But here is the hard truth. Even the best survival strategies could only do so much. Quarantine slowed the plague but did not stop it. Flight saved some individuals but did not save communities. Cleaning and fumigation helped at the margins but did not prevent mass death. The Black Death, once established in a region, was going to kill a substantial portion of the population no matter what people did. And the psychological toll of living through this, of watching your neighbours die, of not knowing if you would be next, of trying strategy after strategy and seeing them fail, that toll was immense. People were not just dying from plague, they were dying from the inside, from despair and exhaustion and terror. The social fabric of medieval Europe was being torn apart thread by thread, and that psychological and social devastation would prove to be almost as transformative as the physical death toll. So we have covered the survival strategies, the things people did to try to protect themselves and their loved ones. Some worked, some did not, but all of them tell us something about human nature under extreme pressure. But now we need to talk about what happened to the people who got sick. What was it actually like to have the plague? What were the symptoms? How quickly did it progress? And why was it so deadly? Because understanding the disease itself is crucial to understanding why it inspired such absolute terror in everyone who encountered it. There is no gentle way to describe what the plague did to the human body. But I think we owe it to the millions who suffered through this to understand their experience, to bear witness to what they endured. So let me walk you through what happened when the plague took hold of someone day by day, symptom by symptom. It usually started with a feeling you might not even notice at first. A slight chill, maybe? A vague sense of being off. You know that feeling when you are coming down with something but you are not quite sick yet? That moment where you think maybe it is nothing, maybe I just need more sleep. That is how it began for most people. But within hours, not days, hours, things would escalate dramatically. The chills would intensify until your whole body was shaking uncontrollably. Then the fever would hit, spiking so high that people became delirious, thrashing in their beds, not recognizing their own family members. Temperatures of 104–105 degrees Fahrenheit. In an era before thermometers, physicians described patients as burning to the touch, their skin so hot it felt like standing near a fire. And then came the pain. Pain started in your joints, a deep aching that made every movement agony. Your head would pound like someone was driving nails into your skull. Your muscles felt like they were being torn apart from the inside. Medieval chronicles describe people writhing in their beds, crying out, begging for relief that never came. But the truly distinctive feature of bubonic plague, the thing that gave the Black Death its name, was the buboes. These were swellings of the lymph nodes, and they were unlike anything physicians had seen before. Imagine waking up on the second or third day of illness and discovering a lump in your groin or under your arm or on your neck. Within hours, this lump would grow to the size of a chicken egg. Some grew even larger, as big as apples or small oranges. The medieval physician Guy de Chauliac, who served as personal physician to Pope Clement VI and actually survived his own bout with the plague, left us detailed descriptions. He wrote that the buboes were exquisitely painful, that even the lightest touch made patients scream. The skin over these swellings would turn dark, sometimes black, sometimes a deep purple. In the most severe cases, the skin would split open, oozing blood and pus that smelled, according to contemporary accounts, like rotting meat mixed with something sweet and sickly. And here is something that really gets to me. People knew what these buboes meant. By the second or third month of the plague in any given city, Everyone understood that if you developed these swellings, you were probably going to die. Can you imagine discovering one on your body? The absolute terror of that moment, knowing that you had maybe 3 days left to live, that you needed to say goodbye to everyone you loved right now while you still could form coherent words, because the timeline was brutally fast. From first symptoms to death was typically 3 to 7 days. 3 to 7 days, not weeks or months of decline like many diseases. Just a handful of days from feeling fine to being in the ground. Medieval people were used to death far more than we are. They saw it all the time, but this speed, this sudden violence was different. It did not give people time to prepare to come to terms, to tie up loose ends. Now, bubonic plague was the most common form, probably accounting for 80 to 90% of cases, but there were 2 other variants, both even more deadly. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream, directly bypassing the lymph nodes. This form was horrifying. The fever was even higher, often reaching 106 degrees or more. The extremities, fingers and toes would turn black as tissue died from lack of blood flow. People would go into shock, their blood pressure plummeting. Many died within 24 hours of first symptoms, often before any other warning signs appeared. Some people literally went to bed healthy and never woke up. Their family members would try to rouse them in the morning, only to discover they had died in the night. And because of the blackened skin, people called this form the Black Death specifically, though later the name came to apply to the entire pandemic. Then there was pneumonic plague, the respiratory form, and this one terrifies me even now. When the plague bacteria infected the lungs, victims would develop a violent cough. They would start bringing up sputum tinged with blood, then streaked with blood, then pure blood. Their breathing would become laboured, wheezing, desperate. They would quite literally drown in their own fluids as their lungs filled with blood and pus. And pneumonic plague was airborne. You could catch it just by being near someone who was coughing. No flea bite required, no contact with infected materials, just breathing the same air as a sick person. This form spread like wildfire. The mortality rate was essentially 100%. If you developed pneumonic plague, you died. Period. There are no recorded cases of anyone surviving it in the medieval period. Medieval physicians watching all this unfold were completely baffled. Guy de Chauliac wrote in his medical treatise that he was utterly powerless, that all conventional treatments failed. He tried everything in his arsenal bloodletting to reduce fever purgatives, to expel evil humours, herbal remedies, prayers, amulets. Nothing worked. His patients died regardless of what he did. And here is what makes his account so poignant. He wrote that the shameful thing was not that physicians could not cure the plague, it was that they could not even understand it. Their entire medical framework, built on centuries of accumulated knowledge, was useless. They had no explanation for why it spread so quickly, why it killed some people and spared others, why it seemed to strike randomly without regard for age or health or virtue. Some doctors did make keen observations, though. They noticed that people who cared for plague victims often got sick themselves. They noticed that the disease seemed to spread along trade routes. They noticed that fleeing infected areas sometimes kept you safe. But they could not put it all together into a coherent theory because they lacked the fundamental concept of contagion as we understand it today. The medieval mind did not really have a framework for person-to-person transmission of disease through invisible agents. They understood that some diseases could spread through contact, sure, but they did not understand how or why. The idea that tiny organisms too small to see could move from one body to another and cause illness, that was beyond their conceptual reach. So when doctors tried to treat the plague, they were working blind. They would lance the buboes, cutting them open to drain the pus, believing this would release the evil humours causing the disease. In reality, this probably just caused additional trauma to patients who were already in agony. The pain of having those swollen, inflamed lymph nodes cut open without anesthesia must have been unbearable. They would apply various poultices to the buboes. Some recipes sound almost reasonable mixtures of herbs like sage and rue with substances like egg yolk and honey, but other remedies were absolutely revolting. One popular treatment involved mixing human feces with other ingredients into a paste and plastering it onto the open sores. The theory was that this would draw out toxins. The reality was that it probably introduced additional infections and made things worse. Another common remedy was theriac, a complex mixture that could contain up to 80 different ingredients, including opium, viper flesh, crushed gems, and various herbs and spices. The recipe was ancient, supposedly created by physicians in antiquity, and it was fantastically expensive. Only the wealthy could afford it. Did it work? Well, the opium probably made people more comfortable by dulling pain and suppressing coughs. But as a cure for plague, useless. Some physicians recommended that patients drink their own urine or bathe in it, believing that urine had purifying properties. Others prescribed solutions made from crushed emeralds or gold dissolved in liquid. The logic was that these precious substances, being pure and valuable, would drive out impurities from the body. The reality was that people were swallowing ground-up rocks or toxic chemicals that did nothing helpful and sometimes caused additional harm. And then there were the more desperate measures. Some doctors recommended placing live chickens or pigeons on the buboes, the theory being that the bird would somehow absorb the disease. You would have a poor plague victim already suffering terribly now with a frightened bird tied to their groin or armpit. The bird would inevitably die, whether from stress or from contracting plague itself, and then you would replace it with a new bird. This continued until either the patient recovered, which was rare, or died, which was common. Bloodletting was practiced on nearly every plague patient. Physicians believed that removing excess blood would rebalance the humours and reduce fever. They would open veins and drain substantial amounts of blood into bowls. For someone who was already weakened by disease, who needed every ounce of strength to fight the infection, losing significant amounts of blood was catastrophic. Many patients probably died from the treatment rather than the disease. There is a reason I am going into such detail about these failed treatments. Not to mock medieval physicians who were genuinely trying their best with the knowledge they had, but to help you understand the absolute desperation people felt. When your child is dying, when your spouse is writhing in pain, you will try anything. You will believe anyone who promises a cure, no matter how outlandish. You will spend your last coin on remedies you know probably will not work, because what else can you do? Give up, watch helplessly as your loved ones die without even trying. This desperation made people vulnerable to charlatans and con artists. Fake doctors showed up in plague-stricken cities selling miracle cures. Religious charlatans sold amulets and charms blessed by saints guaranteed to protect you from the plague. Fortune tellers offered to read your fate to tell you if you would survive. And people bought these things not because they were stupid or gullible, but because they were terrified, and hope is a powerful drug. But amid all this failure and fraud, there were physicians who maintained their integrity. Gentile da Foligno, who I mentioned earlier, stayed in Perugia treating patients even after it became clear that conventional medicine had no answers. He kept detailed records, hoping that future physicians might learn from his observations. He died in June 1348, but his writings survived, and they give us invaluable insights into how the plague manifested and spread. Guy de Chauliac, despite contracting plague himself and nearly dying, returned to work as soon as he recovered. He wrote honestly about his own fear, admitting that he was terrified throughout his illness, convinced he would die. But he also wrote that it would have been shameful to abandon his post to flee, when his skills, limited as they were, might help someone. That takes enormous courage. Many priests and monks also stayed at their posts despite terrible danger. They performed last rites for the dying, heard confessions, offered what comfort they could. The mortality rate among clergy was staggering, possibly even higher than among the general population, because they were in constant close contact with the sick. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Some estimates suggest that 40 to 50% of clergy in England died during the first wave of plague. But here is something that might surprise you. Not everyone who got the plague died. The mortality rate was somewhere between 30 and 75% depending on the form of the disease and individual factors. That means a significant minority of people survived, and their experiences give us hope amid all this darkness. What determined who lived and who died? We are not entirely sure even today. Age was certainly a factor. Recent studies of medieval skeletons from plague cemeteries show that older adults and people with pre-existing health conditions were more likely to die. But the plague killed plenty of young healthy people too. Children were particularly vulnerable, their immune systems not yet fully developed. There is also evidence that some people might have had genetic resistance. Modern genetic studies have found that certain variants of genes involved in immune function provide protection against Yersinia pestis. People with these variants might have had milder cases or even been asymptomatic carriers. Over multiple waves of plague spanning centuries, these protective genes became more common in European populations through natural selection. The plague, in a very real sense, changed the human genome. For those who did survive, the recovery process was long and difficult. Even after the fever broke and the buboes started to heal, people were left weak, exhausted, scarred, both physically and emotionally. The buboes left permanent marks, sunken areas where the lymph nodes had been destroyed. Some people lost fingers or toes to septicemic plague. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, plagued by nightmares and anxiety. But they were alive. And in the context of the Black Death, simply being alive was a kind of victory. Many survivors felt they had been spared for a reason, that God had chosen them to live, while so many others died. This could create intense guilt, survivor's guilt as we call it now. Why me? Why did I live when my children died, when my parents died, when my friends died? Others took a different view. They had stared death in the face and survived. They had won a battle that most people lost. This gave some of them a new perspective on life, a determination to make the most of whatever time they had left. After all, who knew when plague might return, who knew how long anyone had? This mix of trauma and resilience, of guilt and determination, would shape the psychology of plague survivors and influence European culture for generations. People who had lived through the Black Death saw the world differently than those who came before. They questioned authority more readily, because the authorities, both religious and secular, had failed to protect them. They valued life more intensely because they understood how fragile it was. They pursued pleasure more openly because tomorrow might not come. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are still in the midst of the pandemic, in that awful period between 1347 and 1351, when death was everywhere and nobody knew when or if it would ever end. We have talked about the disease itself, about what it did to individual bodies, but what did it do to society? How did communities function, or fail to function, when a third or half of the population was dead or dying? That is a question that takes us into some of the darkest territory of this entire story, but also some of the most revealing about human nature under extreme duress. So let us turn our attention to what happened when the social order started to collapse. Civilizations are fragile things. We like to think of them as solid, permanent, built on foundations of stone and law and tradition. But they are actually more like ecosystems, complex webs of relationships and responsibilities that depend on everyone playing their part. And the Black Death did not just kill people. It severed connections, broke chains, destroyed the invisible threads that held medieval society together. Let me paint you a picture of what happened in the streets of a typical medieval city, let us say Siena, in Italy during the height of the plague in 1348. Siena was one of the great cities of medieval Europe, a centre of banking and art home to about 50,000 people before the plague arrived. An anonymous chronicler who lived through it left us an account that is both heartbreaking and illuminating. He wrote that in the beginning, when the first cases appeared, people tried to maintain normal funeral customs. Bodies were washed and dressed in fine clothes. Priests came to say prayers. Families gathered to mourn. The dead were carried in procession to the church and buried in consecrated ground with full ceremony. This was important, you have to understand. Medieval Christians believed that proper burial rites were essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. Dying without last rites being buried improperly, these were spiritual catastrophes as bad as death itself. But within weeks, the sheer number of dead overwhelmed every social institution. There were not enough priests to perform last rites. Many priests had fled, or they themselves were dying. There were not enough grave diggers to dig individual graves. There were not enough coffins. The carpenter shops could not keep up with demand, and anyway, many of the carpenters were dead or sick. So people started improvising. They laid bodies in the streets, hoping someone would collect them eventually. They buried multiple bodies in single graves strangers packed together in the earth. In some cases, they just dumped bodies into hastily dug pits outside the city walls, dozens or hundreds at a time, with no ceremony, no prayers, no markers. The Sienese chronicler wrote that people died with such abandonment that they were handled and buried like dead goats. Think about what that means. These were people who had lived their entire lives in a society where death rituals were sacred, where the proper treatment of the dead was a fundamental obligation. And now they were reducing their own family members to the status of livestock, not because they did not care, but because there was simply no alternative. The system had completely broken down. But it gets darker. As fear intensified, people started abandoning the sick. The chronicler wrote that fathers abandoned children, husbands abandoned wives, one brother another. If someone in your household fell ill, the safest thing to do was get away from them immediately. And many people did exactly that. They fled their own homes, leaving their sick relatives to die alone. Now, before we judge too harshly, put yourself in that position. You watch plague tear through your neighbourhood. You know that people who care for the sick usually get sick themselves. You have children who are still healthy. Do you stay and care for your sick spouse, knowing you will probably die and orphan your children? Or do you take your children and run, giving them at least a chance at survival? There is no good answer to that question. Both choices involve terrible sacrifice, and thousands of people had to make that choice in real time under conditions of absolute terror, with no time to think it through carefully. It is easy for us comfortable in our modern homes to say what we would do, but we have never faced anything remotely comparable. The abandonment of the sick created a peculiar and grim economic opportunity. Some people, usually the desperately poor who had nothing left to lose, would agree to care for plague victims for pay. They were called beccamorti in Italy, corpse carriers. They would enter infected houses, tend to the sick, remove bodies, clean contaminated materials. It was a death sentence, essentially. Most beccamorti died within weeks of taking the job. But if you were already starving, if your family was on the edge of starvation, the money might be worth the risk. At least your children could eat for a while longer. These corpse carriers were both necessary and despised. Society needed them desperately, but they were treated as pariahs, as contaminated beings who might spread death wherever they went. In some cities, they were required to carry bells or wear special clothing so people could avoid them. They were forbidden from entering churches, markets, or public spaces. When they eventually died, which they almost always did, they were buried in unmarked graves, sometimes not even buried properly at all. The collapse extended to every institution. Markets shut down because merchants died or fled, and because people were too afraid to gather in public spaces anyway. This created immediate food shortages in cities that depended on daily markets for fresh supplies. Without markets, farmers had no one to sell to, so crops rotted in the fields. Meanwhile, city dwellers starved because they could not buy food even if they had money. The legal system ground to a halt. Courts closed because judges and lawyers were dead or gone. Criminal cases were suspended. Civil disputes went unresolved. Property rights, normally so carefully guarded, became murky and confused. If a merchant died and his family died who inherited his warehouse full of goods, what about debts owed to the dead? What about contracts that could not be fulfilled because one party had died? This created chaos and opportunity in equal measure. Some people took advantage of the confusion to seize property that did not belong to them, to forge documents to make claims they never could have made in normal times. Others tried desperately to maintain order, to keep records, to ensure that when the plague ended, society would have some basis for rebuilding. Tax collection, that most fundamental function of medieval government, became nearly impossible. How do you collect taxes when you cannot identify who is alive and who is dead? When the tax collectors themselves are dying? When travelling from town to town to collect revenue means exposing yourself to plague. Some regions went years without effective tax collection, which meant governments could not function, could not pay soldiers, could not maintain roads or bridges or public works. The church, which was supposed to be the spiritual anchor of society, was hit particularly hard. We have records from England showing that in some dioceses, 40 to 50% of parish priests died during the first wave of plague. These were not men who could easily be replaced. Becoming a priest required years of education and training. And during the plague years, who was going to spend years studying for a position that appeared to be a death sentence? So the church had to lower its standards dramatically. Men were ordained with minimal training, sometimes unable to read Latin properly, sometimes barely literate at all. The quality of religious services declined noticeably. Some parishes went months or even years without a priest. Babies died without baptism. Couples could not marry properly. The dying could not receive last rites. For medieval Christians, these were not minor inconveniences. They were spiritual catastrophes, and the church's reputation suffered in other ways too. People had prayed, had made pilgrimages, had donated money to the church, and yet the plague continued unabated. The Pope himself, sitting in his palace in Avignon, surrounded by the best medical care available, seemed powerless. Some people began to question whether the church really had the authority it claimed. If the plague was God's punishment, as the church said, then why were the devout dying alongside sinners? Why were priests supposedly closest to God dying in such numbers? These questions did not lead to mass apostasy or anything dramatic. Medieval Christianity was too deeply embedded in the culture for that, but they planted seeds of doubt that would grow over the coming centuries. The Reformation, which would split Western Christianity in the 1500s, had some of its roots in the spiritual crisis of the Black Death. One of the most fascinating and disturbing responses to social collapse was the rise of what we might call plague communities. These were groups of people, usually relatively young, who banded together specifically to live through the plague. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron is a fictionalized version of this phenomenon, but it was based on reality. The logic went like this: if staying in the city meant almost certain death, and if normal family structures were breaking down anyway, why not form new social units based on survival rather than traditional kinship? So groups of friends, or sometimes strangers, would pool their resources, flee to a rural villa or isolated location and create their own mini-society. Some of these groups were genuinely trying to survive through mutual support. They would share food, take care of anyone who got sick, maintain some semblance of civilized life. But others devolved into something darker. With death all around and the future utterly uncertain, why maintain moral restraints? If there might be no tomorrow, why not indulge every desire today? Contemporary chroniclers describe houses where people gathered to drink and feast while plague raged outside. They describe orgies and debauchery, people abandoning all social norms because those norms seemed meaningless when everyone might be dead next week. Was this actually as widespread as the chroniclers claimed? Hard to say. Medieval writers loved a good morality tale, and stories of sinful behaviour during the plague made great sermons about divine punishment. But there is enough evidence from multiple sources to suggest that yes, some people did respond to the plague by essentially checking out of normal society. They drank, they gambled, they engaged in behaviours that would have been scandalous in normal times. And I find this more sad than shocking. These were people who had watched everyone they loved die, who saw no hope for the future, who were so traumatized by constant death that they could not process it normally anymore. There was also widespread looting and robbery. When a family died or fled their house and possessions were left unguarded, in some cities professional thieves broke into these abandoned homes and stole everything of value. In other cases, neighbours did it, people who in normal times would never have considered theft, but were now desperate and saw an opportunity. Some enterprising criminals went further. They would identify houses where plague had struck, wait until the occupants were dead or too weak to resist, then enter, and steal money, jewellery, whatever they could carry. A few even murdered plague victims to speed things along. These crimes were rarely prosecuted because the legal system was not functioning, and anyway, the criminals themselves usually died of plague within weeks, a kind of rough justice. But I do not want to give the impression that everyone descended into barbarism, because alongside all this horror there were also extraordinary acts of courage and compassion. In Florence, a group of wealthy citizens formed a confraternity specifically to bury the dead when no one else would. They called themselves the Misericordia, the Mercy. Members would go into plague houses, collect bodies, and ensure they received proper burial. Many of these men died from plague they contracted while doing this work, but others stepped forward to replace them. In Siena, some nuns stayed at their convent hospital and cared for the plague victims throughout the epidemic. Nearly all of them died, but they saved lives and maintained human dignity in the face of chaos. In villages across Europe, there are records of individuals who took in orphaned children, who cared for neighbours, who shared food with the starving, who maintained compassion and humanity when it would have been easier to think only of themselves. And here is something that really strikes me. In the midst of all this death and disorder, people kept records. Scribes continued writing chronicles even as they themselves got sick. Notaries drew up wills for the dying. Priests maintained baptism and death records as best they could. Artists created paintings and sculptures documenting the plague. These people understood that what they were living through was historically significant, that future generations would need to know what happened. Why bother keeping records when you think the world might be ending? I think it is because humans are fundamentally meaning-making creatures. We need to believe that our experiences matter, that our suffering has significance, that someone somewhere will remember and learn from what we went through. Those medieval scribes writing by candlelight in plague-emptied cities were reaching across time to us, ensuring that their story would not be lost. The social collapse was not uniform across Europe. Some regions and cities maintained order better than others. Milan, as I mentioned earlier, had extremely strict regulations and harsh enforcement. They sealed infected houses immediately, sometimes with healthy family members still inside. They executed people who tried to flee quarantine. It was brutal, but it kept the death toll lower than in cities with more lenient approaches. In contrast, Florence tried a more laissez-faire approach, initially trusting people to self-regulate to behave responsibly. It did not work. The death rate was catastrophic. By the time city officials tried to impose order, it was too late. The social fabric had already unraveled too badly to repair mid-crisis. This raises uncomfortable questions about the balance between individual liberty and collective survival during emergencies. Milan's authoritarian approach saved lives, but at the cost of terrible cruelty to individuals. Florence's permissive approach preserved freedom but failed to protect the population. There are no easy answers here, and these same debates played out during COVID-19, showing that 700 years later, we are still grappling with the same fundamental tensions. What strikes me most about the social collapse during the Black Death is how quickly it happened. Within months, sometimes weak societies that had existed for centuries simply fell apart. All those carefully constructed hierarchies, all those rules and customs and obligations, they evaporated like mist in sunlight once enough people died or fled. But here is the thing about humans: we are remarkably good at rebuilding. The social collapse was not permanent. Eventually the plague burned itself out, or at least decreased to manageable levels, and the survivors, traumatized and diminished as they were, began the hard work of putting their world back together. But the world they rebuilt was not the same as the one that had been destroyed. It could not be. Too much had changed. Too many people were gone. Too many assumptions had been shattered, and that transformation, that radical reshaping of medieval European society would have consequences that resonate to this day. But that is a story that deserves its own telling. In every disaster there are invisible victims. People whose stories get lost in the chaos, whose suffering goes unrecorded, because nobody with power or education thinks their experiences matter enough to write down. And during the Black Death, the most invisible victims of all were women, children, and the elderly. Let me tell you about someone history almost forgot. Her name was Agnes, and we only know about her because of a court case recorded in England in 1349. Agnes was a widow with 3 young children. When plague came to her village, her husband was among the first to die. As a widow in medieval society, Agnes had almost no rights. Her husband's land reverted to his lord. She had no way to support herself or her children. The court record shows that Agnes was accused of stealing food from her neighbour's field. Just a few turnips and some beans. In normal times, this would have been a minor offence, maybe a small fine, but these were not normal pawns. The judge, probably trying to make an example, sentenced her to public humiliation in the stocks. The record ends there. We do not know what happened to Agnes or her children, but we can guess. Without food, without land, without protection, their chances of survival were almost zero. Multiply Agnes by thousands, by tens of thousands. Women who lost husbands suddenly found themselves without legal protection, without economic means, without status. In medieval society, a woman's identity was almost entirely defined by her relationship to men. You were somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's mother. If all those somebodies died, who were you? What rights did you have? Some widows got lucky. If they were childless, they might remarry quickly. Men who survived the plague needed wives to run their households, and there was suddenly a severe shortage of women of marriageable age. So some widows found new husbands, new security. But widows with children had a much harder time. Men did not want to take on another man's children, especially when resources were so scarce. And pregnant women, their situation was particularly desperate. Pregnancy is risky even in the best circumstances, but during the plague it was often a death sentence. Pregnant women who contracted plague almost always died. Their bodies already strained by carrying a child could not fight off the infection. And even if they survived the plague, they still faced the risks of medieval childbirth. Under normal circumstances, about 20% of medieval women died in childbirth or from complications related to pregnancy. 20%. 1 in 5 women died bringing children into the world. During the plague years, that percentage was probably higher because midwives were dying, because medical care had broken down, because women were malnourished and weakened. And if a woman died in childbirth during the plague, who would care for her newborn? Wet nurses, women who breastfed other people's babies for pay, were in desperately short supply. Many had died or fled. A newborn without a mother or wet nurse would almost certainly die. We will never know how many infants perished this way, but the number must have been substantial. Children faced their own unique horrors during the Black Death. Medieval childhood was already precarious with that 50% infant mortality rate I mentioned earlier. But the plague made everything worse. Children were particularly vulnerable to the disease itself. Their immune systems were not fully developed. They had not been exposed to as many pathogens as adults, so they had less natural resistance. But even more devastating was what happened when parents died. Suddenly there were thousands, maybe millions of orphaned children across Europe. In stable times, extended family would usually take in orphans, but during the plague, extended families were being wiped out. Aunts and uncles and grandparents were dying too, so who would care for these children? Some orphans were taken in by monasteries or convents, which traditionally had a responsibility to care for the vulnerable. But many religious houses were decimated by plague themselves, their populations too reduced to take on additional mouths to feed. Some orphans were taken in by neighbours or distant relatives, acts of compassion in the midst of catastrophe. But many children were simply left to fend for themselves. Medieval towns suddenly had populations of feral children living in abandoned houses, stealing food to survive, banding together for protection. Some cities tried to organise care for orphans, setting up institutions or paying foster families. But resources were stretched impossibly thin. And here is something that breaks my heart. Children who lost their parents during the plague often lost their childhood too. A 10-year-old boy might suddenly find himself responsible for keeping his younger siblings alive. A 12-year-old girl might have to take over running a household doing adult work she was completely unprepared for. These children grew up fast, way too fast, shaped by trauma and loss into something harder than any child should have to be. The elderly faced a different but equally difficult situation. Modern genetic analysis of skeletons from Black Death cemeteries has confirmed what medieval chronicles suggested. Older adults died at higher rates than younger adults. If you were over 60 in 1348, your chances of surviving plague were significantly lower than someone in their 20s or 30s. But it was not just the disease that threatened elderly people. In medieval society, the elderly were typically cared for by their adult children. This was not altruism, it was expectation, obligation, the natural order of things. You raised your children, and when you got old, they took care of you. But what happened when all your adult children died? Who would care for you then? Some elderly people simply starved because there was nobody to feed them. Others died of neglect, lying in their beds, unable to move, waiting for children who would never come. A few were actively abandoned, left behind when younger family members fled the plague. It is a grim reality that in crisis situations, societies tend to prioritize the young and able-bodied over the elderly. Resources go to those who have the best chance of survival, who can contribute to rebuilding. The elderly, seen as having less future ahead of them, get pushed aside. Now, I do not want to paint a picture of universal callousness. There were plenty of adult children who stayed with their elderly parents and cared for them until the end. There were communities that made special provisions for elderly people who had lost their families. but the records also show many cases of elderly people dying alone, uncared for, their bodies found weeks or months later. One aspect of the plague that particularly affected women was the breakdown of the sexual order. Medieval society had very strict rules about sexuality, particularly for women. A woman's chastity was closely guarded, her reputation everything. But when social structures collapsed, when half the population was dead or dying, when nobody knew if they would be alive tomorrow, those rules became harder to enforce. Some women seized this moment of chaos as an opportunity. With traditional authorities weakened, with supervision reduced, they made choices they never could have made before. Some had affairs. Some left marriages that had been miserable. Some, finding themselves suddenly widowed and with property, chose not to remarry and instead ran their own businesses or farms. But this freedom came with danger. Sexual violence against women increased during the plague years. With fewer male relatives to protect them with legal systems, non-functional women were more vulnerable to assault. There are records of rape cases that went unpunished because there were no authorities to prosecute them. Women travelling alone, which many had to do when fleeing plague, were particularly at risk. The plague also created a strange marriage market. Remember, the death toll was not evenly distributed by gender. The disease killed men and women in roughly equal numbers, but among adults, men's higher mortality in some regions created a shortage of husbands. This gave women, particularly young women, more bargaining power in marriage negotiations than they had ever had before. A young woman in 1350 might find herself pursued by multiple suitors, each offering better terms than would have been imaginable before the plague. Some women negotiated for control of their own property, for say in household decisions, for rights that married women normally did not have. The plague, horrible as it was, created openings for women to claim more autonomy. But we have to be careful not to romanticize this. For every woman who benefited from changed circumstances, there were probably 10 who suffered. The ones who lost everyone and ended up destitute, the ones who were forced into marriages with men they did not know, the ones who died in childbirth with no one to help them, the ones who were victimized when nobody was looking. Let me tell you about one particular group of victims that historians have only recently started paying attention to: disabled people and people with chronic illnesses. In medieval society, if you were disabled or chronically ill, you typically depended on family care. There were some hospitals and charitable institutions, but most care happened at home. During the plague, people with disabilities found themselves in impossible situations. If you could not walk and your family died or fled, who would bring you food? Who would help you with basic tasks? If you were blind or deaf, how would you even know what was happening when plague struck your community? How would you navigate a world that had suddenly become even more hostile and dangerous? There are almost no records of what happened to disabled people during the Black Death, because frankly, nobody in power cared enough to write about them. But we can infer that the death rate among disabled people was probably higher than average, not necessarily because they were more vulnerable to the disease itself, but because the support systems they depended on collapsed. Elderly people, women, children, the disabled. These were the people with the least power, the least resources, the least ability to protect themselves, and they paid a disproportionate price during the Black Death. This pattern, where disasters hit the vulnerable hardest, is not unique to the 14th century. We see it in every crisis, every disaster, every pandemic. The people at the bottom always suffer most. But here is something remarkable. Despite everything, despite the trauma and loss and vulnerability, many of these invisible victims survived. And some of them, having survived the worst disaster in European history, found ways to build better lives for themselves in the aftermath. Children who had been orphaned grew up and claimed inheritances. Women who had been widowed found new opportunities. The elderly who survived found themselves valued again as repositories of knowledge and experience in a world where so many experienced people had died. The plague destroyed the old social order, yes, but it also created space for people who had been marginalized to claim new positions. Let me give you a specific example. In England after the plague, there was a massive labour shortage. Suddenly, labourers who had been dirt poor, who had barely scraped by, found themselves in demand. They could negotiate for higher wages, better working conditions, the right to leave one employer for another. Lords who had held absolute power over their peasants found that power significantly reduced. If you tried to enforce the old oppressive terms, your workers would just leave and go somewhere else. This applied to women too. Women who would never have been allowed to work outside the home before the plague found themselves running businesses, managing farms, practicing trades. Some guilds which had traditionally excluded women started accepting female apprentices because they desperately needed workers. Widows took over their dead husbands' businesses and thrived. Young women negotiated apprenticeships in crafts that had been male-only before. Was this gender equality? No, absolutely not. Women still faced enormous discrimination and legal disadvantages, but it was movement in the right direction, a tiny crack in the rigid gender hierarchy that had defined medieval society. And that crack created by the catastrophe of plague would gradually widen over the coming centuries. The same pattern played out for young people. Before the plague, you might have to wait decades to inherit land or a business waiting for your parents to die. But after the plague, with so many people dead, young people inherited early. 25-year-olds found themselves running estates, managing businesses, making decisions that would normally have been made by people twice their age. This created a younger, more dynamic leadership class. People who had grown up during the plague, who had survived it, who had seen the old certainties destroyed. These people were more willing to question tradition, to try new approaches, to take risks. In a very real sense, the plague created a generational shift that would reshape European culture. But I want to be clear about something. None of this makes the plague good or worthwhile. The suffering was real. The trauma was real. The millions of dead were not sacrificed on some altar of progress. They were individuals with hopes and dreams and people who loved them. Every single death was a tragedy. What I am saying is that humans are remarkably good at finding opportunities even in the midst of disaster. We adapt, we adjust, we find ways to keep going. And sometimes the destruction of unjust systems, even when it happens through catastrophe rather than conscious reform, creates space for something better to grow. The invisible victims of the Black Death, the women and children and elderly and disabled people whose stories were barely recorded, they were not just passive sufferers. Many of them were also survivors, adapters, people who navigated an impossible situation and came out the other side changed but alive. Their resilience, their ability to keep going when everything had fallen apart, that is as much a part of the Black Death story as the death and devastation. And their experiences raise profound questions about who gets to be visible in history, whose stories get told, whose suffering gets acknowledged. For every Agnes stealing turnips to feed her children, for every orphan trying to survive on the streets, for every elderly person dying alone, there were probably hundreds more whose names we will never know. They deserve to be remembered too, not just as statistics in the death toll, but as individual human beings who suffered and endured and survived in ways both heartbreaking and inspiring. Their invisible struggle shaped the world we live in today, and we owe them at least the dignity of acknowledgement, even if we can never fully know their stories. But there were others whose stories were recorded, whose voices echo through the centuries with clarity and power, and it is to them we turn our attention now. Words have power. They can capture moments, preserve experiences, make the invisible visible. And during the Black Death, While millions suffered in silence, a handful of writers picked up their pens and created works that would echo through the centuries, giving voice to a generation's trauma. The most famous of these writers was Giovanni Boccaccio, and his masterpiece The Decameron is one of the most extraordinary documents to emerge from the plague years. But what makes it remarkable is not what you might expect. Boccaccio was not writing a tragedy. He was not composing a solemn chronicle of death and suffering. Instead, he wrote 100 stories ranging from bawdy comedy to romance to satire, told by 10 young people who had fled Florence to escape the plague. The framing device is brilliant. These 10 storytellers, 7 women and 3 men, have retreated to a villa in the countryside. Each day, one person is appointed king or queen and chooses a theme for the day's stories. Then each person tells a tale on that theme. It is a storytelling marathon, a deliberate act of creation in the face of destruction. And the stories themselves are often shockingly irreverent, full of sex and trickery and human folly. Why would Boccaccio write this way? Why comedy and romance when thousands were dying in the streets? I think he understood something profound about human psychology. We cannot live in constant grief. We cannot function if we are always dwelling on horror. Stories, laughter, beauty, these are not frivolous escapes from reality. They are how we survive reality. They are how we remind ourselves that life is worth living even when death surrounds us. Boccaccio opens the Decameron with a description of plague-stricken Florence that is absolutely haunting. He describes streets empty except for corpse carriers. He talks about how social customs collapsed, how people abandoned the sick, how the sheer scale of death overwhelmed all normal systems. And then, having established this nightmare backdrop, he pivots to his storytellers and their tales of human nature in all its messy, complicated glory. The message never stated explicitly, but running through the entire work is this: even in the darkest times, humans remain human. We love, we laugh, we scheme, we tell stories. The plague can kill our bodies, but it cannot kill our essential humanity unless we let it. By choosing to tell stories of life rather than death, Boccaccio was making a radical statement about resilience. But the Decameron was not just about survival, it was also sharp social criticism. Many of the stories mock corrupt clergy, incompetent nobles, and hypocritical moralizers. The subtext is clear. These are the people who claimed authority, who said they knew God's will, who were supposed to protect society, and they failed. They died like everyone else, or worse, they fled and abandoned their responsibilities. Boccaccio could never have written this before the plague. The social criticism would have been too dangerous, too subversive, but in the aftermath of the Black Death, with traditional authorities discredited and society in chaos, he could say things that would have been unsayable just a few years earlier. The plague, in destroying the old social order, also destroyed some of the old restrictions on speech and thought. Now let me tell you about a very different kind of writer. His name was Henry, Duke of Lancaster, one of the most powerful nobles in England. In 1354, just a few years after the first wave of plague, Henry wrote a devotional text called the Book of Holy Medicines. It is one of the strangest and most revealing documents from the plague era. Henry wrote it in French, the language of the English nobility at the time, and the entire book is structured as an extended medical metaphor. Henry catalogues his sins, but he describes each sin as a different wound or disease affecting his body. Then he prescribes spiritual remedies using the language of medieval medicine. Pride is an infection, lust is a fever, greed is a putrefying sore, and the cure for each involves prayer, confession, and divine intervention. What makes this fascinating is the timing. Henry was writing just a few years after watching plague devastate England. He'd seen the best medical minds completely helpless in the face of disease. He had seen prayers fail to stop death. And yet here he was turning to medical language to describe spiritual illness, trusting in divine medicine to cure the soul, even though earthly medicine had failed to cure the body. Was Henry being ironic? Was he questioning the efficacy of religion? I do not think so. I think he was trying to make sense of trauma to find meaning in catastrophe. If the plague was God's punishment for sin, as the church taught, then maybe cataloguing your sins and seeking forgiveness was a way to prevent future disaster. It was a coping mechanism, a way to feel some sense of control in a world that had proven itself utterly uncontrollable. Another writer who deserves attention is William Langland, author of a long allegorical poem called Piers Plowman. Langland was not a noble or wealthy merchant. He was probably a minor clergyman, someone near the bottom of the social hierarchy who saw the plague from ground level. Piers Plowman is a dream vision, a journey through a symbolic landscape where the narrator meets personifications of virtues and vices, but woven through the allegory is sharp observation of post-plague society. Langland talks about labourers demanding higher wages. He describes corruption in the church. He questions whether wealth and power have any meaning when death can take anyone at any time. One section that really strikes me is when Langland discusses death personified. Death comes for everyone, he writes. Death does not care if you are king or peasant priest or beggar. This might seem obvious to us, but it was a radical statement in the deeply hierarchical world of medieval England. The plague had proven that social status offered no protection. You could be the richest man in the kingdom and still die choking on your own blood in 3 days. This realization that death was the great equalizer started to percolate through European culture. You see it in art from the period. The dance of death, or danse macabre, became a popular motif. These were paintings or murals showing death as a skeleton, leading people from all walks of life in a dance. A pope, a king, a merchant, a peasant, all dancing hand in hand with death, all equal in mortality. The message was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant that suffering was universal, that even the mighty were not exempt. Terrifying because it meant that nothing could protect you, that everything you had worked for could be snatched away in an instant. This obsession with death and mortality shows up in other forms too. Memorial art changed dramatically after the Black Death. Before the plague tomb sculptures showed the deceased as they wanted to be remembered powerful, beautiful, pious. But after the plague, a new style emerged called the transitombs. These tombs showed the deceased in 2 layers. On top a sculpture of them as they were in life, dressed in fine clothes, peaceful and dignified. But underneath another sculpture showed them as a decomposing corpse, flesh rotting, bones exposed, worms crawling through the remains. It was a stark reminder that beauty and power are temporary, that we all end up as food for worms eventually. You might think this is morbid, and it is, but I also think it reflects a kind of honesty, a refusal to look away from reality. The people who commissioned these tombs had watched their loved ones die horribly. They had seen beautiful bodies reduced to blackened, swollen corpses in a matter of days. They could not pretend anymore that death was peaceful or dignified, so they created art that reflected the truth as they had experienced it. Let me shift gears and talk about a different kind of document legal records and personal letters. These are not literary works, but they give us incredibly vivid glimpses into how ordinary people experience the plague. One letter that survives is from a merchant in Italy writing to his business partner in 1348. He describes how trade has completely collapsed. Ships are sitting in harbours because there are not enough sailors to crew them. Markets are empty. His warehouses are full of goods nobody wants to buy because everybody is either dead or in hiding. He asks his partner when things will return to normal, and you can hear the desperate hope in his words, the need to believe that this nightmare will end. Another letter, This one, from a young woman to her sister, describes losing their entire family, mother, father, 3 brothers, all dead within 2 weeks. The young woman, writing from a convent where she has taken refuge, says she does not know why God spared her. She wonders if she is being punished by being forced to live without everyone she loved. It is a heartbreaking glimpse into survivor's guilt, a phenomenon we recognise now but had no name for then. Court records are also revealing. There are property disputes galore in the years after the plague. Someone claims they inherited land from a cousin who died, but someone else says no, actually they were the rightful heir. These disputes were complicated by the fact that entire families had been wiped out, records had been lost, witnesses were dead. Who could say for certain what had been promised or agreed to when everyone involved was gone? Some cases are darkly humorous in their absurdity. I found one record of a man who claimed ownership of a house because he said the previous owner had promised it to him on his deathbed. The problem was that several other people claimed the same thing. Apparently the dying man had promised his house to at least 5 different people, either because he was delirious with fever and did not know what he was saying, or because he was hedging his bets, hoping that promising things to multiple people would ensure someone would care for him. The courts had no idea how to handle these situations. They were operating in a legal grey area where precedent and custom offered no guidance. Some judges made Solomon-like decisions, splitting property among multiple claimants. Others threw up their hands and ruled based on who had better political connections or who paid a larger bribe. These legal wranglings might seem petty in the context of mass death, but they mattered enormously to the people involved. When you have lost everything, when your entire world has been turned upside down, securing a piece of land or a workshop might be the difference between survival and destitution. These court cases represent people fighting desperately to rebuild their lives from the rubble. Chronicles written by monks also give us important perspectives. Monasteries were centres of learning, and monks often served as the unofficial historians of their regions. During the plague, many monks continued recording events even as their communities died around them. One chronicle from an English monastery records the deaths of brother after brother. The entry for March 3049 lists 12 monks who died that month. April another 15, May 18. By June, the writer notes that he is one of only 7 monks still alive, out of a community that had been over 50 strong. And then the entries stop. Either the writer died too, or he was too overwhelmed to continue. We will never know. These gaps in the historical record, these abrupt endings, they are as eloquent as anything that was written. They remind us that for every story that survived, there are thousands that did not. For every letter preserved, there were countless others that were lost when buildings burned, or when the intended recipient died before the letter arrived. But what did survive tells us something important. It tells us that humans are meaning-making creatures. Even in the midst of catastrophe, even when survival itself was uncertain, people wrote. They told stories. They recorded events. They created art, because this is what we do. This is how we cope with the incomprehensible. The writers and artists of the plague years were engaged in an act of resistance. They were saying in effect that this disaster will not be the final word. We will bear witness. We will create. We will ensure that future generations know what happened here. And in that act of creation, in that determination to make meaning from chaos, there is a kind of victory. Now, all of these writings and artworks, powerful as they are, represent the perspective of the educated elite. Writers like Boccaccio and Henry of Lancaster could read and write Latin, French, Italian. They had leisure time for creative work. They had the materials needed for writing paper or parchment ink, a quiet space to work. But what about everyone else? What about the illiterate majority who left no written record? How did they process the plague? How did they tell their stories? The answer is through oral culture songs, ballads, folk tales passed down through generations. Most of these are lost to us now because nobody wrote them down, but fragments survive and they give us tantalizing hints. There were plague songs, somber ballads about death and loss. There were dark jokes and gallows humour because humans have always used laughter to cope with horror. There were folk tales that tried to explain the plague stories about divine punishment or witchcraft or astronomical disasters. These stories served the same function as the written works of the elite. They helped people make sense of their experience, gave shape to the shapeless terror. And in some ways these oral traditions might have been more honest than the literary works. Boccaccio could afford to be playful and ironic because he had the security of wealth and education for a peasant who had watched their children starve, who had no idea where their next meal would come from. There was no room for literary playfulness. Their stories were raw, unfiltered expressions of grief and fear and desperate hope. We will never fully recover these lost voices, but we can honour them by acknowledging that the story of the Black Death is not complete without them. The chroniclers and poets and artists who left written records were important, yes, but they were a tiny minority. The vast majority of people who lived through the plague left no trace except their bones in mass graves, and yet they were the ones who truly bore the weight of this disaster, who suffered most, who showed the most courage, simply by continuing to exist day after day in a world that had become a waking nightmare. Their silence speaks as loudly as any chronicle if we take the time to listen. Eventually every storm passes, every night, no matter how long, gives way to morning, and by 1351 the first great wave of the Black Death was finally receding. Not gone, not defeated, but diminished. The death rate dropped. Cities that had been ghost towns started to show signs of life again. Markets reopened, fields were planted, people emerged from hiding and began the monumental task of rebuilding their world. But the world they rebuilt was not the same as the one that had been destroyed. How could it be? When a third to half of your population dies in 5 years, when every social institution has been tested and found wanting, when every certainty has been shattered, you cannot simply go back to business as usual. Something fundamental had changed, and the changes rippled outward in ways both obvious and subtle. Let me start with the most immediate and dramatic change of the labour shortage. Before the plague, Europe had too many people and not enough land or resources. There was fierce competition for jobs, for land, for any opportunity to make a living. Lords could demand almost anything from their peasants because if you did not like the terms, well, there were 10 other desperate people ready to take your place. But after the plague, suddenly there were fields with nobody to plough them, workshops with nobody to work in them, entire villages abandoned because everyone had died or fled. And the survivors, the ones who had made it through, they realized something important. They had power now. Real, tangible power for the first time in their lives. Imagine you are a farm labourer in England in 1352. Before the plague, you worked for a lord who paid you barely enough to survive. You worked his land several days a week for free as part of your feudal obligations. You could not leave without his permission. You had essentially no rights. But now there are 3 other lords competing for your labour. The lord to the north is offering double wages. The lord to the west is offering land of your own. The lord to the south is offering to waive all those feudal obligations. If you will just come work for him, what do? You negotiate. Maybe for the first time in your life you have leverage. You can say no. You can demand better terms, you can leave and go somewhere else if your lord refuses to treat you fairly. And this happened across Europe. Wages for agricultural workers doubled, sometimes tripled in the years after the plague. The price of labour skyrocketed because labour had become scarce. The wealthy and powerful hated this. They saw it as the natural order being turned upside down. Peasants, the lowest of the low, were acting like they had rights, like they deserved decent treatment. It was outrageous. So the elites did what elites always do when their power is threatened. They tried to legislate their way back to dominance. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351 just as the plague was ending. This law attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It forbade workers from leaving their lords to seek better opportunities elsewhere. It made it illegal to pay more than the statutory wage or to demand more than that wage. Violation could result in fines or imprisonment. Similar laws were passed across Europe. In France, in Italy and the German states, everywhere the elites tried to use legal force to maintain the old social order. And do you know what happened? These laws failed. Not immediately, not completely, but they failed. Because you cannot legislate away economic reality. When you have more jobs than workers, wages go up. That is basic supply and demand. Workers ignored the laws. They demanded higher pay anyway. They left for better opportunities anyway. And many lords desperate for labour ignored the laws too. They paid the higher wages because otherwise their crops would rot in the fields. The government could pass all the laws it wanted, but it could not enforce them effectively when both workers and employers had incentives to ignore them. This was revolutionary in ways that are hard to overstate. For the first time in centuries, the lowest classes had economic leverage. They could improve their conditions not through rebellion or violence, but simply by withholding their labour. This planted seeds that would grow into the labour movements of later centuries, into ideas about workers' rights and fair wages and the dignity of labour. But the economic changes went beyond just wages. The whole structure of feudalism started to crack. Feudalism, remember, was built on personal relationships and obligations. You owed service to your lord in exchange for protection and the right to work his land. But when labour became valuable, these personal relationships started being replaced by cash relationships. Lords who could not get workers to fulfill their traditional obligations started offering money instead. They would say, okay, instead of working my fields 3 days a week, just pay me this amount of money, and you can work your own land full time. This is called commutation of labour services, and it spread rapidly in the decades after the plague. What this meant in practice was that peasants were slowly transforming from serfs bound to the land and their lord into tenant farmers who paid rent. It was a shift from a feudal economy to something more like capitalism, though that word would not be invented for centuries. And it gave peasants more freedom, more mobility, more control over their own lives. Some peasants even managed to buy their freedom outright. With wages so high and land so cheap because there were fewer people competing for it, a hard-working peasant could accumulate enough money to purchase freedom for their entire family. Before the plague, this would have been almost impossible. After the plague, it happened with surprising frequency. Now not all lords accepted these changes gracefully. Some tried to enforce the old obligations by force. They would drag peasants back who had fled. They would refuse commutation and demand personal service. They would impose fines and punishments for any act of disobedience. And this created enormous resentment among the peasant class, a simmering anger that would eventually explode into violence. In 1358, just a decade after the plague, French peasants rose up in a massive rebellion called the Jacquerie. The immediate trigger was the financial burden of the 100 Years' War, but underlying it was fury at lords who were trying to maintain medieval hierarchies in a post-plague world that no longer supported them. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but it showed that something fundamental had shifted. Peasants were no longer willing to accept their subordination as natural or inevitable. The same pattern played out in England in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by radical preachers like John Ball English, peasants marched on London, demanding the end of serfdom, the commutation of labour services and fair rents. They actually succeeded in capturing London briefly and meeting with the young King Richard II. Their demands were initially accepted, then betrayed when the rebellion was crushed. But again the message was clear. The old order was dead even if the elites refused to bury it. These rebellions failed in their immediate goals, but they succeeded in something more important. They established that peasants could organise, could articulate demands, could challenge authority. They shifted the Overton window, as we might say today. Things that had been unthinkable before the plague, demanding the end of serfdom, claiming human dignity regardless of birth, became thinkable, sayable, fightable. The plague had not just killed people, it had killed certainties. Let me shift to urban areas because the economic transformation was equally dramatic in cities. Before this plague, most crafts and trades were controlled by guilds, exclusive associations that regulated who could practice a craft, how they could practice it and what they could charge. Guilds were hereditary. You got in usually by being born into a guild family or by serving a long apprenticeship. After the plague, with so many craftsmen dead, the guilds faced a crisis. They needed workers desperately, but their traditional recruitment methods were too slow, so they started accepting people who had never have been admitted before. Lower class people, foreigners, even women, though this was more limited. Some guilds merged because they did not have enough members to function independently. Others lowered their standards for admission. Still others created new lower tiers of membership for people who had learned trades quickly rather than through traditional apprenticeship. The rigid hierarchy of crafts started to become more flexible, more meritocratic, though we should not exaggerate this. Medieval society remained deeply hierarchical, but there was movement opportunity that had not existed before. Women in particular found new opportunities in the post-plague economy. With so many men dead, women stepped into roles that had been exclusively male. They ran businesses, practiced trades, managed estates. Some guilds that had excluded women began accepting them as members. Widows who inherited their husbands' businesses often proved to be skilled managers, and some cities passed laws protecting their right to continue those businesses independently. This did not translate into gender equality. We are still talking about deeply patriarchal societies. But it was a crack in the wall, a demonstration that women could do work that men had claimed was beyond their capacity. And that lesson once learned could not be completely unlearned, even when men later tried to reassert exclusive control over professions and trades. The plague also changed patterns of land ownership and wealth concentration. With so many people dead, there was a massive transfer of wealth through inheritance. Some individuals inherited from multiple relatives and suddenly found themselves wealthy. Other people who had been landless were able to purchase abandoned farms or claim vacant properties. This created a new class of people who had money, but not noble birth. Merchants, successful farmers, master craftsmen. They accumulated wealth and started demanding a say in how society was run. They wanted political representation. They wanted laws that protected their property and interests. They wanted respect and status that traditionally came only with noble blood. In some Italian city-states, these newly wealthy commoners essentially took over government. Venice, Florence, Milan. These were run not by feudal lords but by wealthy merchant families. They created republican forms of government, elected council systems that gave at least some citizens a voice. This was not democracy as we understand it. Voting rights were still restricted to wealthy men, but it was a step away from pure aristocratic rule. Even in places that remained monarchies, kings found they had to negotiate with these newly powerful commoners. They needed their money to fight wars and maintain government. So they granted charters, created parliaments, made concessions that would have been unthinkable before the plague. The balance of power was shifting slowly and unevenly, but shifting nonetheless. Another major economic change was the shift from grain farming to sheep raising in many regions. Before the plague, with so many mouths to feed every available acre, was devoted to growing food. But after the plague, with the population reduced and labour scarce, many landowners converted farmland to pasture. Sheep required much less labour than grain farming. A single shepherd could manage hundreds of sheep over a large area. This was economically rational from the landowner's perspective, but it had huge social consequences. It meant fewer jobs in rural areas, which pushed people into cities. It meant large tracts of land being enclosed, fenced off for sheep, which displaced small farmers and peasants. It changed the landscape, literally replacing the patchwork of small fields with vast open pastures. And it shifted England in particular toward a wool-based economy. English wool became prized throughout Europe. The textile industry boomed. Fortunes were made in wool trading. This economic transformation, triggered by the labour shortage after the plague, set England on a path that would eventually make it a commercial powerhouse. The roots of England's later industrial revolution can be traced back to these post-plague economic changes. One aspect of the economic transformation that is often overlooked is how it affected the church. The church was by far the largest landowner in medieval Europe. It controlled vast estates, collected tithes, owned properties in every town and village. But the church was hit particularly hard by the plague. Clergy died at high rates. Donations dried up as people focused on immediate survival. Church lands went untended because there were not enough workers. In the aftermath, the church found itself in financial crisis. It owned all this land but could not find enough people to work it profitably. So the church, like secular lords, had to start paying higher wages, commuting feudal obligations, making concessions to workers. This undermined the church's economic power and indirectly its spiritual authority. If the church, supposedly guided by divine wisdom, had to bow to the same economic pressures as everyone else, what did that say about its special status? If church lands were subject to the same laws of supply and demand as secular estates, where was God's favour in that? These questions did not have satisfying answers, and they contributed to growing skepticism about church authority. The economic changes after the Black Death were not a simple story of progress or improvement. They created winners and losers. They solved some problems while creating new ones. They opened opportunities for some while closing them for others. But they fundamentally restructured European economy and society in ways that moved Europe away from feudalism and toward early capitalism, away from rigid hierarchy, and towards somewhat more flexible social structures. And here is what fascinates me most about all this. None of it was planned. Nobody sat down and said, "Let us use this plague to reform the economy." These changes emerged organically from millions of individual decisions made by people trying to survive and rebuild their lives. The plague destroyed the old structures, and in their absence, new structures grew, shaped by the altered landscape of post-plague reality. But economic change, important as it was, tells only part of the story. The plague also transformed culture, religion, politics, psychology in ways that were equally profound. And those changes, working together with the economic shifts, would create a Europe that looked very different from the one that had existed before 1347. So let us turn our attention now to these broader cultural transformations, to how the Black Death changed not just how people worked and earned their living, but how they thought about themselves and their place in the world. Money can change hands, laws can be rewritten, fields can be replanted. But how do you rebuild trust in God when God just let half your world die? How do you reconstruct meaning when everything you believed turned out to be useless against death? These are the questions that haunted plague survivors, and the answers they found would reshape Western civilization. The Catholic Church entered the plague years as the most powerful institution in Europe, perhaps the most powerful institution in human history up to that point. It owned roughly a third of all land. It had authority over spiritual matters that translated into enormous temporal power. Kings needed the Pope's blessing. Peasants needed the Church's sacraments. Everyone from the highest noble to the lowliest beggar lived within the Church's cosmology, its understanding of how the universe worked. And then the plague came and the Church's authority crumbled like a sandcastle in a storm. Start with the most obvious problem: priests died in huge numbers. Some estimates suggest that 40 to 50% of clergy in England and France died during the first plague wave. These were not just numbers, these were the men who performed baptisms, marriages, last rites. These were the men who heard confessions, who offered absolution for sins, who stood between ordinary Christians and God. When your priest died, and the replacement died, and the next replacement died, what were you supposed to think? Was God angry at his own servants, or were priests not actually any closer to God than anyone else? Either answer was troubling. If God was punishing his clergy, what hope did ordinary sinners have? If priests had no special protection, what was the point of their special status? The Church tried to address the clergy's shortage by ordaining men with minimal training. Before the plague, becoming a priest required years of study. You needed to be literate in Latin to understand theology, to have demonstrated your commitment and worthiness. But in the desperate years of 1348 to 1350, men were ordained after weeks or months of preparation. Some priests could barely read the liturgy. Some did not understand the Latin words they were speaking. They were performing rituals by rote magic words whose meaning escaped them, and people noticed. When the priest stumbles through the Mass, when he cannot answer basic theological questions, when he is clearly just as scared and confused as everyone else, his authority diminishes. The mystique evaporates. He becomes just a man in fancy clothes, not a conduit to the divine. There was also the uncomfortable fact that many priests fled when the plague arrived. Not all of them, to be fair. Many stayed and died heroically. But enough fled that it became scandalous. These were men who preached sacrifice and duty, who told their parishioners to accept suffering as God's will, and then when suffering arrived, they ran. The hypocrisy was not lost on anyone. A radical priest named John Ball, who would later play a major role in the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, preached a sermon that became famous. He asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In other words, if we all descend from Adam and Eve, if we were all equal in the Garden of Eden, where does nobility come from? Where does hierarchy come from? Who decided that some people are lords and others are peasants, that some are clergy and others laity?" This was dangerous revolutionary thinking. The entire medieval social structure was based on the idea that hierarchy was God-ordained, natural, permanent. Kings ruled by divine right. Lords owned land by God's favour. Priests had authority because God chose them. But Ball was suggesting that these hierarchies were human inventions, not divine mandates. And in the aftermath of the plague, when those hierarchies had so obviously failed to protect anyone, his words resonated. The Church's theological explanations for the plague were also deeply unsatisfying. The official line was that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. This was the standard medieval explanation for any disaster. Crop failure, God's punishment. Earthquake, God's punishment. Plague, obviously God's punishment. But this explanation created more problems than it solved. If the plague was punishment for sin, why did it kill pious monks and nuns alongside notorious sinners? Why did it kill innocent children who had barely had time to sin at all? Why did some notoriously wicked people survive while deeply devout people died? The theology did not add up, and people noticed the inconsistencies. Some church authorities tried to argue that the righteous were being taken to heaven early, spared from having to witness further horrors. But this just raised new questions. If dying of plague was actually a reward, why was everyone so terrified of it? Why did priests flee? The logical contradictions were glaring. What this theological crisis did was plant seeds of doubt, not wholesale rejection of Christianity. Medieval people were far too deeply Christian for that. But doubt about whether church authorities really understood God's will. Doubt about whether the church's interpretation of Scripture was correct. Doubt about whether priests and bishops and even the Pope had any special insight into divine matters. These doubts would grow over the coming decades and centuries. They would contribute to movements like the Lollards in England, who argued that people should read the Bible themselves rather than relying on priestly interpretation. They would feed into the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, when Martin Luther and others would openly challenge papal authority. The plague did not cause the Reformation directly, but it created conditions that made the Reformation possible. Let me tell you about another religious response to the plague that reveals how desperate people were for answers the Church could not provide. In 1349, groups of men calling themselves flagellants began appearing across Europe. They would travel from town to town in processions of hundreds, sometimes thousands, whipping themselves until their backs were bloody. The flagellants believed that by inflicting suffering on themselves, they could atone for humanity's sins and convince God to end the plague. They would gather in public squares and strip to the waist. Then, while chanting prayers and hymns, they would beat themselves with leather whips embedded with metal spikes. Blood would flow, flesh would tear. The spectacle was both horrifying and mesmerizing. Common people flocked to see the flagellants. Many believed these men were saints, holy martyrs whose suffering might actually work. The flagellants claimed they could forgive sins, perform miracles, even that they were superior to ordinary priests because their penance was more severe, more authentic. The Church hated this movement. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellants in 1349, calling them heretics and ordering them to disband. Why? Because they represented direct challenge to church authority. If random laymen could forgive sins through self-torture, what was the point of priests if these men had a direct connection to God through suffering? Where did that leave the church hierarchy? But the popularity of the flagellants showed how desperate people were for anyone who seemed to have answers. The Church said, "Pray and attend Mass, and maybe God will have mercy." The flagellants said, "Hurt yourself enough and God has to listen." Neither approach worked. The plague continued regardless, but at least the flagellants seemed to be doing something concrete, something visible, something that felt like action rather than passive acceptance. The flagellant movement was eventually suppressed, but it left a mark. It showed that ordinary people were willing to seek spiritual solutions outside official church channels. It demonstrated that the Church's monopoly on religious expression was not as total as it had seemed, and it established a tradition of radical religious movements that would recur throughout medieval and early modern history. Another major shift in religious culture was the increasing focus on personal piety and individual relationship with God. Before the plague, religion was primarily communal. You went to church with your community, you prayed together, you celebrated feast days together. Your relationship with God was mediated through the church, through priests, through sacraments. But the plague disrupted all of that. Churches closed or had no priests. Public gatherings were dangerous. People died alone without last rites, and in this isolation many people developed a more personal individual approach to religion. They prayed alone in their homes. They read devotional texts if they could read or memorized prayers if they could not. They tried to establish direct connections with God without priestly intermediaries. This trend toward personal piety would grow stronger in the centuries after the plague. It would lead to the development of movements like the Devotio Moderna in the Netherlands, which emphasized personal meditation and individual spiritual development. It would contribute to the rise of mysticism of people claiming direct experiences of the divine. And ultimately it would help create the spiritual climate in which Protestantism could flourish, with its emphasis on individual faith rather than institutional religion. The plague also changed how people thought about death itself. Before 1347, death was certainly present in medieval life. People died all the time from disease, injury, childbirth, violence. But death was generally seen as a transition, a doorway to the next life. If you died in a state of grace with your sins confessed and absolved, you would go to heaven, or at least to purgatory where your soul would be cleansed before entering heaven. But the Black Death introduced a new kind of death, sudden and horrible and overwhelming. People died before they could confess. They died without last rites. They were buried in mass graves without proper ceremony. And this created enormous anxiety. What happened to souls that died without the sacraments? Were they damned? Were they trapped in limbo? Nobody really knew, and the church could not provide reassuring answers. This anxiety manifested in several ways. One was the rise of what we call the ars moriendi, the art of dying. These were books and manuals that taught people how to prepare a death, how to die well. They described the temptations the devil would present at the moment of death and how to resist them. They provided prayers and meditations for the dying and for those attending them. The ars moriendi tradition shows people trying to regain some control over the dying process. If you could not prevent death, at least you could prepare for it. You could make sure your soul was ready. You could die with dignity and purpose rather than in confused terror. It was a way of asserting human agency in the face of mortality. Another manifestation of death anxiety was the increasing popularity of chantries and memorial masses. Wealthy people would leave money in their wills for priests to say masses for their souls after death, sometimes in perpetuity. The idea was that these prayers would speed the soul's journey through purgatory to heaven. Before the plague, this was a luxury only the very rich could afford. But after the plague, as more people had money, and as anxiety about the afterlife intensified, chantries became much more common. It was like an insurance policy for your soul. You could not control whether you would die suddenly without warning, but you could at least ensure that somebody would be praying for you afterward. The cultural shift around death is also visible in art and architecture. I mentioned earlier the transitombs that showed the deceased as both living and as a rotting corpse. But there were other artistic changes too. Before the plague, religious art tended to emphasize the glorious, the triumphant, the beautiful. Christ in majesty, Mary crowned as Queen of Heaven, saints in glory. After the plague, religious art became much more focused on suffering and death. Crucifixion scenes became more graphic, more focused on Christ's physical agony. Images of martyred saints emphasized their torture and pain. And new artistic motifs emerged, like the Man of Sorrows, showing Christ wounded and bleeding but still standing still, enduring. Why this shift? I think it reflects people trying to find meaning in their own suffering by connecting it to Christ's suffering. If Jesus himself experienced horrible pain, if God allowed his own son to suffer, then maybe human suffering had purpose too. Maybe it was not just random cruelty, but part of some larger divine plan that humans could not fully understand. This might not seem comforting to us, but for medieval Christians it was. It meant that their pain, their loss, their grief, all of it had meaning. It was not just chaos and horror, it was participation in the mystery of divine suffering and redemption. Whether this theological reframing actually helped people emotionally is hard to say, but they clearly clung to it. Another major cultural change was the increasing skepticism toward authority in general, not just religious authority. When the plague arrived, people turned to their leaders for protection and guidance. Kings, nobles, bishops, learned physicians, all the people who were supposed to know what to do in a crisis. And all of them failed spectacularly. Kings could not protect their subjects. Nobles abandoned their responsibilities and fled. Bishops preached sermons that did nothing. Physicians prescribed treatments that killed as often as they cured. Every authority figure, every institution, every source of traditional wisdom proved inadequate. This created a crisis of confidence that went beyond religion. It made people question all forms of authority. If the experts were wrong about this, what else were they wrong about? If traditional hierarchies could not handle a real crisis, why should they be maintained? These questions did not lead to immediate revolution, but they created a cultural environment where questioning authority became more acceptable. You can see this in the literature of the period. Writers became more critical, more satirical, more willing to mock the powerful. Boccaccio's Decameron, which we discussed earlier, is full of stories that show nobles and clergy as foolish, corrupt, or hypocritical. This kind of social criticism existed before the plague, but it became more common and more pointed afterward. The same skepticism extended to traditional learning and education. The universities had taught that careful study of ancient texts would reveal truth. Medical schools had taught that Galen's theories were correct and complete. Theological schools had taught that church doctrine had answered all important questions, but the plague revealed that all this learning, all these carefully preserved ancient texts, all this accumulated wisdom was useless when confronted with a real problem. This did not lead to immediate rejection of traditional education. Universities continued, books continued to be studied, degrees continued to be awarded. But there was a shift, subtle but important, toward empiricism, toward observation and experimentation rather than pure reliance on authority and ancient texts. This shift would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution, to the idea that knowledge comes from testing and observing nature rather than just reading what Aristotle or Galen wrote centuries ago. The plague also changed how people thought about pleasure and enjoyment. In the depths of the pandemic, with death everywhere, some people responded by pursuing pleasure intensely, desperately. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But after the plague, this attitude persisted and evolved into something more complex. There developed a philosophy never formally articulated but widely held that life was short and precious and should be enjoyed. Not hedonism exactly, not pure self-indulgence, but a sense that postponing happiness was foolish when you might die at any moment. This manifested in increased spending on luxuries, more elaborate celebrations of holidays and festivals, greater emphasis on comfort and beauty in daily life. The art and architecture of the late 14th and 15th centuries reflect this. More ornate, more decorative, more focused on aesthetic pleasure than earlier medieval styles. The Renaissance, which was just beginning in Italy as the plague receded, was partly an expression of this new attitude. Life is short, so let us create beauty, let us enjoy beauty, let us make our brief time on earth as rich and meaningful as possible. But this was paired with an almost manic awareness of death's presence. The Dance of Death frescoes I mentioned earlier showed up everywhere in churches, in public buildings, even in private homes. They served as reminders that no matter how much pleasure you pursued, no matter how beautiful you made your surroundings, death was always waiting. It was a strange duality, joy and terror, existing side by side, neither one cancelling the other out. This cultural moment, this unique combination of pleasure-seeking and death-awareness, of skepticism toward authority and deep religiosity, of social upheaval and cultural flowering, This was the world that emerged from the Black Death. It was not the medieval world anymore, not quite. But it was not yet the modern world either. It was something in between, something transitional, something unstable and creative and dangerous. And that unstable transitional world was about to give birth to changes even more profound than anything we have discussed so far. Here is something most people do not realize about the Black Death. It never actually ended. Not really. The first wave. The catastrophic outbreak of 1347 to 1351 that we have been discussing, that eventually burned itself out. The death rate declined. Life began returning to something resembling normal. But the plague itself, the disease, it stuck around for centuries. Think about that for a moment. Imagine living in a world where you know with absolute certainty that the plague could come back at any time. Maybe next year, maybe next month, maybe tomorrow. You've already watched it kill half the people you know, you've seen what it does, and now you have to live with the knowledge that it is still out there, lurking, waiting for the right conditions to explode again. That is the reality Europeans faced for the next 400 years. The plague returned in waves outbreaks that swept through cities and regions with terrifying regularity. These later outbreaks were not as deadly as the first one, but they were still catastrophic. And they came again and again and again, like a recurring nightmare you could never quite wake up from. The second major wave hit in 1361, just a decade after the first wave ended. This one had a grim nickname, the Pestis Secunda, the second plague, though some contemporaries called it the children's plague because it seemed to hit young people especially hard. There is actually a logical explanation for this. Adults who had survived the first plague had some immunity. Their bodies had fought off the disease once and retained some ability to fight it again. But children born after 1351, they had never been exposed. They had no immunity at all. So when the plague returned, it tore through this new generation with devastating force. Chronicles from England described the 1361 outbreak as particularly heartbreaking because it killed so many children and young adults. These were the hope for the future, the generation that was supposed to rebuild and repopulate. And here was the plague again, cutting them down before they had a chance to live. Families who had survived the first plague intact found themselves destroyed by the second, and it kept coming back. Major outbreaks in 1369, again in 1374, 1390, 1400. The pattern continued into the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. Some outbreaks were localized, affecting a single city or region. Others spread more widely. But there was always plague somewhere in Europe, and everyone knew that at any time it might arrive in their town. This created a fundamentally different psychological landscape than anything we experience today. Yes, we face threats. Yes, we worry about diseases and disasters, but we do not live with the certainty that a disease that killed half our grandparents' generation will probably return to kill some portion of our generation. That is what medieval and early modern Europeans faced. Constant ongoing threat that could erupt into catastrophe without warning. How do you live in a world like that? How do you plan for the future when the future is so uncertain? How do you maintain hope when you know that everything you build might be destroyed, everyone you love might be taken? These questions shaped European culture for centuries after 1351. One response was the institutionalization of plague management. Remember how I talked about quarantine being invented during the first plague? Well, in the centuries that followed, quarantine became more sophisticated, more organized, more effective. Cities established permanent health boards with specific responsibilities for monitoring and responding to plague outbreaks. Venice, always at the forefront of public health innovation, created increasingly elaborate systems. They had officials whose only job was to watch for signs of plague. If a case was reported, the patient's house was immediately sealed with guards posted to prevent anyone from leaving. All contacts were isolated. Ships arriving from plague-affected regions were held at the lazarettos for 40 days of strict quarantine. Were these measures perfect? No, the plague still got through, but they significantly reduced mortality compared to areas without such systems. Venice had major plague outbreaks, but they were generally shorter and less deadly than in cities without organized public health responses. Other cities copied Venice's model. Milan, Florence, Genoa, they all developed similar systems. Public health as a concept and as a government function was born from the ongoing struggle against plague. Another response was the development of early epidemiology. Doctors started keeping careful records of plague cases, noting patterns, trying to understand how the disease spread. They observed that plague often arrived at ports, first suggesting it came by ship. They noticed it spread more easily in crowded areas. They saw that people who avoided contact with the sick were more likely to survive. Again, they did not understand the actual mechanism. They did not know about bacteria or the role of rats and fleas. But through careful observation, they identified patterns that allowed them to make predictions and take preventive action. When plague broke out in one part of a city, authorities would immediately focus resources on neighbouring areas, expecting the disease to spread there next. Often they were right. This empirical approach, learning from observation rather than relying solely on ancient texts, represented a shift in thinking that would eventually contribute to the development of modern science. The plague, horrible as it was, forced people to pay attention to evidence, to test their assumptions, to learn from failure. Those habits of thought would prove valuable far beyond the specific context of plague management. There were also technological responses. Some cities invested in improved sanitation, better water systems, cleaner streets. They recognized, even without understanding germs, that filth and disease seemed connected. So they hired street cleaners, established waste disposal systems, passed ordinances requiring property owners to maintain certain standards of cleanliness. Did this stop the plague? No, but it probably helped reduce transmission of other diseases and improved quality of life in general. Unintentionally, by trying to fight plague, cities made themselves healthier and more pleasant places to live. It is one of those odd historical ironies where trying to solve one problem accidentally solves several others. The recurring plague also drove innovations in medicine and medical education. Each outbreak was a horrifying natural experiment, a chance for doctors to observe the disease and try new treatments. Most treatments still did not work. Medieval medicine remained limited by lack of understanding of disease mechanisms, but there was gradual incremental progress. Some doctors began advocating for isolation of the sick earlier in the disease course. Others developed better techniques for supportive care, keeping patients hydrated and comfortable even if they could not cure the underlying disease. Still others experimented with different drugs and treatments, slowly building a body of knowledge about what helped and what harmed. Medical schools began placing more emphasis on clinical observation, on actually examining patients rather than just reading books. The University of Padua in Italy became famous for its practical approach to medical education. Students did not just study ancient texts, they observed. Real patients performed dissections, learned anatomy through hands-on investigation. This was revolutionary, a break from the purely theoretical approach that had dominated medieval medical education. Was this because plague made old methods obviously inadequate? Partly, but also the recurring threat of plague meant society desperately needed competent doctors. There was strong pressure to improve medical training, to find approaches that actually worked. That pressure drove innovation in ways that peace and prosperity never would have. The ongoing plague threat also affected urban planning and architecture. In the 16th and 17th centuries, some cities were redesigned with wider streets, better ventilation, more green spaces. The theory based on miasma beliefs was that good air circulation would prevent plague. Again, the theory was wrong, but the practical result was cities that were more livable, more beautiful, better designed for human habitation. You can still see this legacy in European cities today. The grand boulevards of Paris, the organised street grids of some Italian cities, the parks and open spaces that dot urban landscapes. Many of these were created or expanded partly with plague prevention in mind. Trying to avoid disease, city planners accidentally created more humane, attractive urban environments. But beyond these practical responses, there is something else I want to talk about. How the ongoing threat of plague changed European mentality at a deeper level. Living with the constant possibility of outbreak created a particular psychological profile, a way of thinking about time and risk and life that shaped European culture in subtle but profound ways. One manifestation was a kind of fatalism mixed with fierce attachment to life. People accepted that plague might come, that death might take them at any moment. They could not control that, but they could control how they lived in the meantime. This led to both religious devotion, preparing one's soul for sudden death, and intense worldly encouragement, squeezing as much experience as possible out of whatever time remained. This tension between accepting mortality and fiercely embracing life shows up everywhere in Renaissance and early modern culture. Think about Shakespeare writing during plague years in London. His plays are full of death, full of awareness of mortality, but they are also full of vibrant life of passion and humour and human complexity. That combination of death, awareness and life affirmation is very much a product of living in a plague culture. The same tension appears in the visual arts. Paintings become more realistic, more focused on capturing the beauty and detail of the physical world. Artists develop perspective, learn to render light and shadow with stunning accuracy, create works that celebrate visual reality. But at the same time, these same artists are filling churches with images of death, with memento mori reminders that all beauty fades, all life ends. Living with plague also created a culture of resilience and adaptability. Europeans learned generation after generation how to bounce back from catastrophe. Plague would hit, population would crash, economy would collapse, and then slowly people would rebuild. They would replant fields, reopen shops, have children to replace those lost. It was an ongoing cycle of destruction and renewal that taught a particular kind of toughness. This cultural resilience forged in the ongoing struggle with plague would prove valuable in other contexts too. When Europeans faced other challenges, whether wars or economic crises or political upheavals, they had centuries of practice at surviving and rebuilding. They knew how to keep going when things looked hopeless. They knew that devastation was not permanent, that societies could recover even from terrible losses. But there was a dark side to this too. The same adaptability that allowed recovery also led to acceptance of horrific mortality as normal. People became in a sense numb to death. When plague killed 2% or 5% or 10% of your city's population every few years, you stopped seeing it as shocking. It became background noise, a regular occurrence like winter storms or summer droughts. This normalization of death had consequences. It made European societies harder, more willing to accept casualties, more comfortable with violence and suffering. The wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, the religious conflicts, the colonial conquests, they all involved staggering death tolls. And Europeans accepted these losses partly because they were already living in a culture where mass death was routine. I am not saying plague caused European imperialism or the wars of religion, but it created a psychological environment where those things were possible, where people could tolerate levels of death and suffering that might have been unthinkable in a society without plague experience. Death had been domesticated, made familiar. That familiarity had both positive and negative effects. Let me give you one more example of how the ongoing plague shaped European development, The economic effects of repeated outbreaks, each plague wave killed people, which created labour shortages, which drove up wages, which gave workers bargaining power. This pattern repeated across the 14th, 15th and into the 16th century. The cumulative effect was to gradually erode feudalism and create conditions for early capitalism. Labour became a commodity to be bought and sold. Workers gained mobility, moving to wherever wages were highest. Markets for labour goods and capital became more sophisticated. All of this was accelerated by the recurring labour shortages caused by plague. Would capitalism have developed anyway without plague? Probably eventually. But plague sped up the process dramatically. It destroyed old economic structures and forced the creation of new ones. And because outbreaks kept happening, there was no chance for the old feudal order to fully reassert itself. Each plague wave reinforced the changes created by the previous one. By the early 16th century, Europe looked radically different from how it had looked in 1347. Population had mostly recovered, though it took until about 1500 to regain pre-plague levels. But this was not the same Europe with the same social structure. It was transformed economically, culturally, politically, religiously. And much of that transformation was driven by the ongoing, recurring presence of plague. The last major plague outbreak in Western Europe was the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720. After that, plague essentially disappeared from Europe, though it continued to rage in other parts of the world. Why did it disappear? We are not entirely certain. Better public health measures probably helped. Changing rat populations might have played a role. Climate changes could have been a factor. Possibly human populations had developed some genetic resistance. But for 4 centuries, from 1347 to 1720, plague was a constant presence in European life. Think about what that means. That is roughly equivalent to the time span from today back to the American Revolution. Can you imagine if the entire modern era, every generation from the Founding Fathers until now, had lived with the ongoing threat of a disease that killed 30 to 50% of people during major outbreaks? That is what Europeans endured. And they did not just endure, they adapted, they innovated, they created new social structures, new economic systems, new ways of thinking about health and disease and government responsibility. The plague was a catastrophe, but it was also paradoxically a driver of change and innovation. Not because suffering is good, but because humans are remarkably good at learning from disaster, at building something new from ruins. The recurring plague created modern Europe in ways both obvious and subtle. It shaped institutions, transformed economies, restructured societies, reshaped cultures. It killed tens of millions and caused unimaginable suffering. But it also forced Europeans to develop new tools for surviving and managing disaster tools that turned out to be useful for many other purposes. And those tools, those innovations, those new ways of thinking and organizing society, they would help create the world we live in today. So as we approach the end of our journey through the Black Death, let us turn our attention to the question that matters most. What does all of this mean for us now? If you have been listening to this whole story and thinking it sounds eerily familiar, you are not wrong. The parallels between the Black Death and recent events are striking, sometimes uncomfortably so, and that is precisely why this medieval pandemic matters to us today, not just as history, but as a guide, a warning, and perhaps even as a source of hope. Let me take you back to early 2020. A new disease is spreading from China along international trade routes. Scientists are scrambling to understand it. Governments are implementing quarantines, closing borders, restricting movement. People are panic buying supplies. Misinformation spreads faster than the disease itself. Healthcare workers are dying trying to save patients. Some people are denying the disease exists. Others are blaming specific ethnic groups. The economy is collapsing. Social systems are straining to the breaking point. Sound familiar? It should. Because we just lived through a pandemic that followed almost exactly the same patterns as the Black Death, just on a compressed time scale and with modern technology. COVID-19 was not as deadly as the plague, thank goodness for vaccines and modern medicine, but the social dynamics, the human responses, the institutional failures and successes, they were remarkably similar to what happened in 1347. Let us start with the most obvious parallel: quarantine. When COVID hit, countries around the world implemented lockdowns, travel restrictions, isolation of infected individuals. Where did these strategies come from? They came from Ragusa in 1377. They came from Venice in the 1400s. They came from centuries of Europeans learning through bitter experience that separating sick people from healthy people slows disease transmission. We did not invent quarantine in 2020. We inherited it from medieval people who figured out without understanding germs or viruses that isolation works. That is both humbling and impressive. These medieval folks working with limited knowledge and primitive tools developed a public health strategy so effective that we are still using it 700 years later. But here is where it gets interesting. Just like in medieval times, quarantine in 2020 was deeply unpopular. People protested lockdowns. They complained about restrictions on movement and assembly. They found ways to evade rules to sneak around restrictions. Small businesses suffered. The economy tanked. People made heartbreaking choices between economic survival and disease prevention. And just like in medieval times, enforcement was uneven. Wealthy people had advantages. They could work from home or delivery isolate in comfortable houses with yards. Poor people, essential workers, they had to keep going out, keep exposing themselves to risk because they had no choice. The pandemic revealed and amplified existing inequalities exactly as the Black Death did. We also saw the same pattern of people looking for someone to blame. In 1347, Europeans blamed Jews, foreigners, travellers. In 2020, we saw racism against Asian Americans, attacks on Chinese people, conspiracy theories about bioweapons and deliberate infection. The specifics changed, but the underlying psychology was identical. When people are scared and confused when they cannot control the threat, they look for a scapegoat, someone to punish, some way to make sense of chaos. This should worry us. It means that 700 years of civilization, 700 years of education and enlightenment and progress have not fundamentally changed how humans respond to pandemic-level stress. We still panic, we still blame, we still prioritize our own group over others. The technology changes, but the psychology remains remarkably constant. But there are also reasons for optimism in this comparison, because we also saw the same patterns of courage and compassion that emerged during the Black Death. Healthcare workers risking their lives to treat patients just like physicians and priests in the 1300s, neighbours helping each other, checking on the elderly and vulnerable, communities organising mutual aid, people making masks, delivering food, providing support however they could. The medieval chroniclers who stayed at their posts recording events, they have modern equivalents in journalists and scientists who kept working, kept documenting, kept trying to understand and explain what was happening. The impulse to bear witness, to create meaning from chaos that persisted too. And that is beautiful, I think. It suggests that the best parts of human nature are just as durable as the worst parts. Another striking parallel is the medical response. In 1347, physicians tried everything they could think of: bloodletting herbal remedies, amulets, prayers. Most of it did not work, but they kept trying. In 2020, we tried hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, various antibody treatments, different ventilator strategies. We had much better science guiding us, but we were still essentially doing the same thing, desperately experimenting, trying to find something that worked. And eventually we did find things that worked, Vaccines, antiviral medications, better treatment protocols. Just as medieval Europeans eventually figured out that quarantine helped, we figured out how to reduce mortality through medical intervention. The timeline was much faster, months instead of centuries, but the process was similar: observation, experimentation, learning from failure, incremental progress. Here is another parallel worth noting: the economic aftermath. After the Black Death, we saw labour shortages, wage increases, workers demanding better conditions, the erosion of old economic structures. After COVID, we saw the Great Resignation, workers re-evaluating their priorities, demands for remote work and better pay, whole industries having to adjust to new realities. It is not identical, obviously. We did not lose 30 to 50% of the population. But the pattern is similar. A crisis creates disruption, a disruption creates opportunity. Some workers leverage that opportunity to improve their conditions. The relationship between worker and employer shifts when workers become scarce, or when they realize they have more power than they thought. We are also seeing similar questioning of authority. Just as the Black Death led people to doubt whether kings and priests and doctors really knew what they were doing, COVID led to widespread skepticism about government public health. Institutions, medical establishment, media, basically every traditional source of information and authority. Some of this skepticism is justified. Institutions did make mistakes, but some of it is destructive, leading people to reject expertise altogether, to believe conspiracy theories, to make decisions based on misinformation. This is dangerous, and it is not new. The medieval flagellants who rejected church authority in favour of their own practices, the people who blamed Jews despite evidence that Jews were dying of plague too, they were driven by the same rejection of expert consensus, the same preference for explanations that felt right emotionally, even if they did not make logical sense. We have better information available now, but we are just as susceptible to ignoring it when it contradicts our beliefs or fears. So what lessons can we actually learn from comparing these two pandemics? First, preparation matters. The cities that had established public health infrastructure before plague arrived, like Venice with its health boards and lazarettos, they did better than cities that tried to improvise responses during the crisis. Similarly, countries that had pandemic preparedness plans in place before COVID, that had stockpiles of equipment and trained personnel and clear protocols, they generally handled the crisis better than those that did not. This seems obvious, but we consistently fail to act on it. After COVID receded, how many governments maintained or increased their pandemic preparedness budgets? How many invested in building permanent infrastructure for the next crisis? Not as many as should have, I suspect. We do the same thing humans have always done: survive the crisis. Breathe a sigh of relief, then slowly forget and neglect preparations, because preparing for hypothetical future disasters is expensive and politically unrewarding. Medieval Europeans made the same mistake initially. After the first plague wave, many cities let their emergency measures lapse. Then the plague came back in 1361, and they had to scramble to reinstate them. After a few cycles of this, they learned to maintain permanent public health institutions. Maybe we need a few more pandemic cycles before we learn that lesson too. I hope not, but history suggests that is how humans work. Second lesson: communication matters enormously. During the Black Death, the lack of accurate information led to panic conspiracy theories and counterproductive responses. During COVID, we had the opposite problem. Too much information, much of it contradictory or deliberately misleading. But the result was similar: confusion, mistrust, people making bad decisions based on bad information. Figuring out how to communicate effectively during crises remains an unsolved problem. How do you convey uncertainty without undermining confidence? How do you change recommendations as understanding evolves without seeming inconsistent? How do you combat misinformation without appearing defensive? These are questions medieval authorities struggled with, and we still struggle with them today. Third lesson. Inequality kills. During the Black Death, the poor died at higher rates than the rich. During COVID, the same pattern held. Essential workers, people in crowded housing, people without access to healthcare, they suffered more. This is not an accident or an unavoidable feature of pandemics. It is a policy choice. Societies could choose to protect vulnerable populations better. They could choose to provide paid sick leave, housing support, healthcare access. They usually do not, or at least not sufficiently. Why? Because protecting the vulnerable is expensive, and the people making budget decisions are typically not the vulnerable ones. This was true in 1347, and it is true now. Until we address underlying inequalities, pandemics will always hit some people much harder than others. The Black Death did not teach us this lesson well enough, apparently, because we are still making the same mistakes 700 years later. Fourth lesson, and this one is more hopeful. Humans are remarkably resilient. The Black Death killed up to half of Europe's population. That is almost inconceivable scale of loss. And yet Europe recovered. Not quickly, not easily, but it recovered. Population rebounded, economy rebuilt, culture flourished. The Renaissance, one of the great flowerings of human creativity, emerged from the ashes of plague. This does not mean suffering is good or necessary for progress, but it does mean that even catastrophic losses do not have to be permanent. Societies can bounce back. We have done it before and we can do it again. When things seem hopeless, when losses seem insurmountable, history suggests that humans have a remarkable capacity for renewal. Fifth lesson: systems under stress reveal their true nature. The Black Death exposed which medieval institutions were actually functional and which were propped up by tradition and inertia. Institutions that could adapt, that served real purposes, that earned their authority through competence, they survived. Institutions that existed mainly because they had always existed, that demanded obedience without offering value, they crumbled. COVID did the same thing. It revealed which businesses actually needed in-person work and which did not. It showed which social institutions could transition to digital formats and which depended on physical presence. It exposed which government agencies were capable of rapid response and which were too bureaucratic to adapt. Some of these revelations were uncomfortable, but they were valuable. They showed us what we could change, what we should change. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not saying that pandemics are good because they drive change. The suffering is real, the losses are real, the trauma is real. If we could achieve positive changes without pandemic-level catastrophe, that would obviously be better. But given that pandemics do happen, given that they have happened repeatedly throughout history and will happen again, we can at least learn from them, use them as opportunities to examine and improve our systems. The Black Death led to the development of public health infrastructure, to changes in labour relations, to questioning of ossified authority structures. Some of those changes were painful in the short term, but beneficial in the long term. COVID has the potential to drive similar beneficial changes if we are thoughtful about it. Better pandemic preparedness, obviously, but also potentially rethinking work patterns, improving healthcare systems, addressing inequalities that were exposed. Whether we actually learn these lessons is up to us. History does not determine the future. Humans have agency, choice. We can look at the patterns, see what worked and what failed in past pandemics, and make informed decisions about how to handle future ones. Or we can ignore history and repeat the same mistakes. Both options are available. What gives me hope is that we do seem to be getting better slowly. Medieval Europeans took centuries to develop effective plague management strategies. We developed COVID vaccines in under a year. Yes, there were failures and inequities in distribution. Yes, many countries botched their responses, but the fact that we had vaccines at all, that we could develop them so quickly, that represents real progress. Similarly, while misinformation was rampant during COVID, we also had more access to accurate information than any previous generation in history. Scientists shared data in real time. Epidemiological models were publicly available. Anyone with internet access could learn about the disease, understand transmission dynamics, make informed decisions. Not everyone took advantage of this, but the information was there in a way it never had been for past pandemics. We are not doomed to repeat history exactly. We can learn from it, can use it to inform better responses. The Black Death has lessons to teach us if we are willing to listen. Lessons about resilience and adaptation. Lessons about institutional failure and innovation. Lessons about human nature under stress, both its darkness and its light. And perhaps most importantly, lessons about perspective. The Black Death was by any measure one of the worst disasters in human history. And yet here we are. Europe survived, recovered, eventually thrived. Humanity persisted. That is not a reason to minimize suffering or to be complacent about future threats. But it is a reason for hope. It is evidence that even from the darkest moments renewal is possible. Even from the greatest losses, something new can grow. And that brings us to our final thoughts on this long dark journey through history. We have travelled a long road together tonight, you and I. We started on the docks of Messina in October 1347, watching 12 ships arrive bearing death. We walked through the horror of the plague years, through collapsed societies and overwhelmed hospitals, through mass graves and abandoned villages. We met peasants and kings, doctors and priests, the lucky survivors, and the countless dead. We watched medieval Europe die and something new struggle to be born from its ashes. But now, as we near the end of this journey, I want to step back and ask a bigger question. What does it all mean? Not just the facts and dates and death tolls, but the human story underneath. What does the Black Death tell us about who we are as a species, about how we face impossible challenges, about what happens when everything we thought was solid turns out to be sand, I think? The first and most important lesson is this: we are tougher than we know. The people of the 14th century did not think they were particularly brave or resilient. They were just ordinary folks trying to survive another day. And yet they endured something that from our comfortable modern perspective seems almost unendurable. Half their world died. Every certainty shattered. Every institution failed. And they kept going. They planted crops even knowing they might not live to harvest them. They had children even knowing those children might die young. They built and created and loved and laughed even with death as a constant companion. That is not just survival, that is defiance. That is humanity saying to the universe, you can kill us, but you cannot make us stop being human. Stop caring, stop hoping, stop trying. And here is what really gets me. They did not just survive, they built something better. Not intentionally, not through careful planning, but through millions of small choices, small acts of courage and adaptation. The post-plague world, for all its ongoing problems, was in many ways an improvement. Workers had more rights, social mobility increased, public health infrastructure emerged. Scientific thinking began replacing pure reliance on ancient authority. Art flourished, culture evolved. Would it have been better if the plague had never happened? Obviously, yes. 30 to 50 million people would have lived full lives instead of dying horribly. The trauma and suffering were real and terrible. But given that the plague did happen, given that it could not be prevented or stopped with medieval technology, the human response was remarkable. People took catastrophe and somehow eventually transmuted it into progress. This is not to glorify suffering. I want to be crystal clear about that. Suffering is not ennobling or necessary or good. If we could have all the positive changes without the plague, that would be infinitely better. But humans have this remarkable ability to find meaning in suffering, after the fact, to take even the worst experiences and extract some lesson, some value, some reason to keep going. The medieval people who survived the plague could have descended into nihilism and despair, some did temporarily, but most eventually chose to find meaning in their survival, to honour the dead by building a world worth living in, to create beauty and knowledge and community from the ruins. That choice, that determination to make survival mean something that is one of the most essentially human things we do. Let me tell you one more story, a small one that I think encapsulates what I am trying to say. In 1352, just as the first wave of plague was ending, a mason in England named John was hired to work on a church. This church had been damaged during the plague years, left half finished when the original workers died. John could have done a quick shoddy job. After all, who knew if the plague might return? Why waste effort on something that might not matter? But John did beautiful work. We have records describing the intricate stone carvings he created, the attention to detail, the evident care and skill. And when someone asked him why he bothered, why he put so much effort into a building when the world seemed to be ending, he reportedly said something like, "'Cause if I'm going to survive, I might as well create something worth surviving for." And that sentiment, that choice to create rather than destroy, to build rather than surrender, that echoes through the centuries. We see it in Boccaccio writing stories while Florence died around him, in doctors staying at their posts even knowing they would probably die, in parents caring for children even after losing half their family, in artists creating beauty, in scribes keeping records, in ordinary people doing ordinary work with extraordinary courage. The Black Death revealed something fundamental about human nature. Yes, we saw darkness, cruelty, cowardice, selfishness, scapegoating, but we also saw light, compassion, courage, resilience, creativity. We are capable of both. And in the worst moments, when everything is stripped away and we are facing annihilation, we get to choose which aspect of our nature we feed, which legacy we leave. Most of the people we talked about tonight made the choice toward light. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough that civilization continued, that knowledge was preserved, that the human story did not end in 1351. They chose to be gardeners planting seeds they might never see grow, builders constructing edifices they might never see finished, teachers passing on knowledge to students who might not survive to use it. That is what hope looks like in the darkest times. Not naive optimism that everything will be fine, but the determination to act as if the future matters even when you have no guarantee there will be a future. To create, to love, to care, to try, even in the shadow of death. That is the gift the plague survivors gave us, the example of how to endure the unendurable with dignity and purpose. Now you might be thinking, okay, that is all very inspiring, but what does it mean practically? What am I supposed to do with this information? Fair question. Let me offer some thoughts. First, remember that systems that seem permanent can collapse very quickly. Medieval Europeans thought feudalism was the natural order of society decreed by God, permanent as the mountains, and then in a few short years it started crumbling. This should make us humble about our own institutions, our own certainties. The things we think are solid might be surprisingly fragile, which means we should maintain them better, fix problems before they become crises, not assume that because something has always been a certain way, it always will be. Second, invest in resilience, not just efficiency. Modern systems are often optimized for efficiency, just-in-time supply chains, minimal redundancy, everything running at maximum utilization. This works great until it does not. When a crisis hits, efficient systems break. Resilient systems bend. They have backup plans, extra capacity redundancy that seems wasteful in good times but becomes essential in bad times. The cities that maintained permanent public health infrastructure between plague outbreaks did better than those that dismantled everything during peaceful periods. Same principle applies today. Third, pay attention to inequalities before they explode. The peasant revolts after the Black Death were driven by anger that had been building for centuries, anger about exploitation and injustice that the plague finally made intolerable. We see the same pattern throughout history: unaddressed grievances, structural inequalities that seem stable until suddenly they are not. If you want a stable society, you have to actually address people's legitimate complaints, not just suppress them. This seems obvious, but we consistently fail to act on it until crisis forces change. Fourth, maintain capacity for rapid adaptation. The institutions that survived and thrived after the plague were the ones that could change quickly, that could abandon old methods that did not work and try new approaches, the ones that insisted on doing things the way they'd always been done, that could not adapt, they withered or disappeared. In a rapidly changing world, adaptability is survival. And finally, remember that we are all connected. The plague spread because medieval Europe was an interconnected world. Trade routes, pilgrim paths, military campaigns, all of it created networks through which disease could spread. Our world is far more connected than theirs was, which means diseases can spread even faster, but also that solutions can spread faster. Information innovations aid. All of it can move around the globe in hours. Our interconnectedness is both our vulnerability and our strength. So what is the ultimate message of the Black Death? I think it is this: humans have faced existential catastrophes before and survived. We will face them again. Climate change, future pandemics, whatever challenges the universe throws at us, we have evidence that we can endure them, not without loss, not without suffering. But we can endure, and more than just endure, we can emerge, changed, hopefully improved, carrying forward the best of what came before while leaving behind what did not serve us. The world after the Black Death was not the same as the world before. It could not be. But in many ways it was better. It was more dynamic, more flexible, more open to new ideas and new possibilities. We have that same opportunity with our own challenges. We can let crises destroy us, or we can let them transform us. We can cling desperately to systems that no longer work, or we can build new ones. We can turn inward and blame each other, or we can recognize our common humanity and work together. These choices are available in every generation, in every crisis. The people of the 14th century chose more often than not to keep trying to keep building, to keep hoping, even when hope seemed foolish. They planted gardens in the ruins. They wrote stories for future generations. They created art that still moves us 700 years later. They did not know if their efforts would matter if humanity had a future, but they acted as if it did. And because they did, we are here. We exist because enough medieval people made the choice to keep going, to create rather than destroy, to hope rather than despair. We are their legacy, the distant future they could barely imagine but still work toward. So when things seem dark, when challenges seem insurmountable, when you wonder if your efforts matter, remember the plague survivors. Remember that people have faced worse and endured. Remember that small acts of courage and creation matter, even if you cannot see how. Remember that the future is not written, that every generation gets to choose what legacy it leaves. The Black Death killed tens of millions. It destroyed the medieval world. but it did not destroy humanity. We survived, we learned, we adapted, we built something new. And that story, that long arc from catastrophe to renewal, that is the story of our species. That is what we do. We endure, we persist, we create meaning from chaos and hope from despair. 700 years ago, 12 ships arrived in Messina carrying death, but they also inadvertently carried the seeds of transformation. The world that emerged from the plague years was unimaginable to the people watching those ships dock. They could not see the hospitals and universities and democracies and human rights that would eventually grow from the ruins of their world. They just knew they had to survive one more day, get through one more night. And they did. Day after day, night after night, year after year, they persevered. And eventually morning came. Not the same morning that had dawned before the plague, but a new morning, a different world built by survivors who refused to let catastrophe have the final word. We are those survivors' children, hundreds of generations removed, but still carrying their legacy. Their courage, their resilience, their stubborn determination to keep being human, even when humanity seemed doomed. That is in us too. That is who we are, who we have always been, who we will continue to be when the next crisis comes. So take heart, take hope, take inspiration from the fact that humans have survived the unsurvivable before and will again. The road may be long, the night may be dark, but morning comes, it always has. And when it does, we will be there, battered perhaps, but unbroken, ready to build again, to create again, to live again. Thank you for walking this dark road with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these stories of loss and survival, of death and renewal. I know it has been heavy, but I hope you found something valuable in it, some insight or inspiration, or simply the comfort of knowing that humans have faced terrible things before and endured. The story of the Black Death is over, but the human story continues. Your story continues. And who knows what future historians will say about our time, about how we faced our challenges, about what we built from our own ruins. That story is still being written, and you are part of it. Sleep well, friend. Dream of gardens growing in ruins of stories told by candlelight of people who refused to surrender to darkness. Dream of survival and renewal and the stubborn, beautiful resilience of the human spirit. And when you wake, remember that you carry within you the legacy of everyone who ever faced impossible odds and chose to keep going anyway. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. There are more stories to tell, more history to explore, more lessons to learn from the long human journey. I will be here when you are ready to listen. Good night.